Out here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest this week. It's the turn of the musician, singer, songwriter, record producer, composer, author, manager, and inventor. It is the one and only Richard James Burgess, who I spoke to very recently to find out more about life, love, poetry, and all that groovy stuff. Was in various bands, including Easy Street, then Landscape, who had the big hit Einstein a Go-Go, produced Spandau Ballet's first couple of albums, and then worked with such people as Adam and also Buggles and Five Star, and lots more besides. But anyway, you're going to find out more about that in this interview. So after several minutes of interesting but casual chat, we get down to the exciting subject of the early formative years. Richard, it's over to you.
So my grandparents and my parents were very much sort of radio people, and we used to sit around and listen to the radio a lot when I was very young. I was born in 49, so I'm 76 now. And so I grew up on just general pop radio back in the early 50s, and it could be everything from sort of Pat Boone, April Love, to, country music such as it was back then, like a song that there was one song I remember, it was one of those talking blues country records. I think it was called The Ace of Spades or something like that. And then, but really what really sparked me personally, what really caught my imagination and made me go out and buy a record, was The Shadows, really. And so Lonnie Donegan. And then I later realized that Lonnie Donegan had been getting all his material from Lead Belly. And I think I was 12 or 13, maybe 14, when I walked into a record store in Christchurch, New Zealand, because my first 10 years I grew up in England, and then we immigrated to New Zealand, and the next 10 years I lived there. I realized when I walked in this record store, the guy there, the way those record store people, they always knew what you liked, and he said, "You got to hear this." And so he put this record on the turntable, and I went into the booth and put the headphones on, and I realized it was everything I'd ever listened to that Lonnie Donegan had done, but it was by somebody who sounded a lot more authentic, and it was Lead Belly.
Right.
So that was a really major awakening for me. And then, of course, almost simultaneously, the whole British blues boom hit, and the Beatles, the whole Mersey Beat thing, and then there were some London bands as well in there, and it was just game on. It's like,
yes,
this is it. It was amazing.
So did you experience that kind of musical change in the 60s? Were you sort of kind of going through it year by year, or probably month by month, as the sort of musical sonic soundscape changed as we entered sort of psychedelic rock?
Well, I one thing I always say to people, I know exactly which vinyl tile in our kitchen I was standing on when I first heard the Beatles. It was Love Me Do. And I was walking across the kitchen, and this record came on the radio, and that opening harmonica part, and I just thought, in my, whatever it was, probably 14-year-old brain, I'm like, maybe I was 12. Yeah, I was 12. I'm like, life will never be the same again.
Right, yes.
And it really kind of wasn't, actually, because it sort of really shaped my entire life. And then, later I dug in, because the Beatles were sort of like a sampler for everything that was going to come, and especially that track, because it has that harmonica and it's got the kind of bluesy kind of feel to it. But then you had the Rolling Stones. I discovered them right after that, and I thought, well, that's much better than the Beatles, and which, obviously don't necessarily hold that view these days, but I do think Rolling Stones were an incredible, force for good in the music at that time. And then, of course, just everything else, John Mayall and the Blues Breakers. Then I totally got into Cream, Led Zeppelin. I wasn't so into the West Coast psychedelic rock stuff, although I was aware of it and I did like it. I mean, I love the Doors. To this day, I still love the Doors. And By the way, I don't listen to any of this stuff these days, but when I hear it, I'm like, oh my gosh, yeah, it's so incredible.
Well,
Uh,
quite. And did you,
yeah,
because you were a few years younger than sort of Bowie and Lemmy, who were both born in
right.
1947, they would always say, when they were asked their sort of musical moment, it was always Little Richard, and then it was, Buddy Holly, Eddie
Yeah,
Cochran, people like that, that kind of Fats Domino sort of sound. But Little Richard was always the one, and then
I know.
Elvis. But did Little Richard come on your radar at all?
Well, I really like Little Richard, but it's interesting you bring this up because I think this is a really important point. I think if you were the first boomers, like if you were born in 45 or 46 or 47, um, you're exposed to music in a very different way than the 49ers and the 50s, because a lot of us are born in 49, 50, 51, 52. And we sort of were the second generation of boomers, really, even though it was only a 3 or 4 year difference. And so while I was aware of Little Richard, I honestly, like Elvis Presley, for instance, I didn't particularly like Elvis. I mean, now obviously appreciate Elvis for what he did and how important he was. Um, but at the same time, it was kind of girls' music when I was growing up, because it was sort of past the Sun Records period, the Jailhouse Rock
Yes,
kind of thing. They were into the whole, uh,
Hawaii.
yeah. Yeah,
Yes.
that's all.
And
That's all
and what
right.
about, I mean, you mentioned blues. What about the kind of jazz world with you know, John Coltrane and the sort of the beat poets and Ginsberg and Kerouac? Did you sort of find that, would be a certain age that people would have gone, yes, I loved Miles Davis or any of those kind of characters that started bebop jazz.
I'm a huge Miles fan. I mean, I when I was working at the Smithsonian, I produced the the box set Jazz the Smithsonian Anthology, and I, I I put more tracks, more Miles tracks on that album, that box set, than any other tracks. I mean, I had a committee of people who know jazz from all kinds of directions. I put together a committee so that we would have a very, sort of broad spectrum of opinions. But between us, we all agreed that Miles should have more tracks on it than anybody else. Somebody said to me, "Well, is this because you particularly love Miles, or you think Miles is the most important jazz artist of all time?" And it was not that. The reason was because Miles was at the beginning of or kicked off more different styles of jazz than any other jazz artist. I mean, you could argue that Louis Armstrong might be the most important jazz musician of all time. Or you could argue that Buddy Bolden was, but we don't have any recordings of him. There are a lot of ways you could argue it out, who's the most important. I don't think it's really a worthwhile argument. But Miles, he was a bebop, he was cool, he was, you know, he did modal jazz, and we have all kinds of different styles on there from Miles. He's just a really important figure. But my introduction to Miles came a bit later. I was aware of him a little bit, but the thing that turned me on my head was Bitches Brew, actually. And I remember I bought Bitches Brew because I'd read about it, and I got it home, and I literally couldn't understand it. I had to play it like every day for about 6 months or 9 months to try to figure out what it was all about. And I don't think I ever really figured it out until many, many years later. I was writing an article about something about jazz, and I did a bunch of research, and I found out how Tio Macero, edited it together on tapes. It was like music concrete, which by then I knew all about music concrete. So because I studied jazz at Berkeley, I studied classical music at Guildhall, and I was also just an avid sort of learner about everything. I'm a student of everything really, life, but music,
Yes.
whatever. I just
Yes.
if I can learn something, I'm happy. Um, so it was kind of like piecing all these bits and pieces together. So to your point about the beatnik thing, yeah, I was totally obsessed with beatnik thing. So like God knows how I got through high school because I used to sit in the back of physics class and all the other classes and sort of read Jack Kerouac books. And I mean, basically, I got through it because I would read I would read the books, the course books, and I did all right in school, but it wasn't because I was paying attention in class, that's for sure.
Yes.
Um, so I was obsessed with the beatniks and obsessed with the whole, 60s movement and all the big cultural changes that was happening. And then the other thing, one of the reasons I went to Smithsonian was because they have the Lead Belly collection, but also they're very sort of involved in this sort of folk revival period of the late 50s, which is also, tied very closely with the beatnik movement and the poetry of New York. So I live in New York now, and I've always been intrigued by, these places like New York's one because it had that period. Paris is one because it had the period, a bit before that with Jean-Paul Sartre and people like that. And then, I'm in London too. I mean, I was lucky enough to be part of that whole Blitz thing,
Yes.
movement, with the New Romantic thing, which was kind of, another one of those movements. But I arrived in England right when the whole glam thing was hitting, by the way. Mark Bolan, T-Rex. Well, T-Rex had happened a bit before that, but Gary Glitter, you name it.
So, sort of 67, you were just a kind of still sort of a teenager in the sort of latter period. I mean, obviously, that was the kind of summer of love. They had the event at Golden Gate Park in San Francisco,
Incredible,
and
yeah.
then the 14-hour color dream, 14-hour
Yeah.
color dream. Yes, at Ali Pali. I mean, what was it like in 67 in New Zealand? Were you hanging out? You were a perfect age to be sort of getting excited
Yeah.
about the world of Pink Floyd and Arthur Brown and psychedelic trip.
Well, I mean, I loved Arthur Brown. Fire, I think it's one of my favorite tracks of all time to this day. But I think, I mean, it was such an amazing record. But there were so many amazing records out then. There's also all the bands like Deep Purple have sort of somewhat been forgotten, but they were an amazing group too. And of course, I played all this stuff because I was playing in bands and we were doing covers, and that was the kind of thing that really influenced me. So virtually everything we've mentioned I've played at some point in cover bands, and then subsequently went on to sort of create my own music that was based, as things always are, based around the kind of influences that you grew up with. Um, I think, the interesting thing is New Zealand and Australia at that time were a little bit behind the times. Although interestingly, we got the Beatles in 62, whereas the US only got the Beatles in 64. So some things were pretty immediate. But I was in Australia in 1970, and I would describe that as the summer of love down there. It was extremely hippie, and and it was amazing. I mean, it was a full-on experience. Sydney was a great place to experience the summer of love because the weather's incredible, and it's just a beautiful city. And the city was not as gentrified as it is now, so you could live in what are now incredibly expensive areas like Darlinghurst and Paddington. And in fact, my first place there was a squat, and with 3-inch cockroaches, by the way. And then subsequently, I did actually rent a place, but I had a place that now would cost you several $1 million for, a pittance, really. So yeah, no, it was all a bit jumbled up down there, and drugs also didn't get down there quite as much, So like, it was kind of Australia before I even came across marijuana or LSD or hash or anything like that. So, things were a bit delayed.
So
But
why did the drums come into your life? Why did you aim for that kind of instrument as your go-to sort of sound?
so what happened was is an interesting um, point. My family was very working class. Both my parents worked at factories, and they're very, very smart people, but they just didn't have a lot of opportunity in life. They didn't come from my mother's mother died at 4. She was farmed out to family, shortly after that. My father's mother died at 4. His father died at 10. So, it was a hard scrabble life for them. And so they always, wanted me to, get an education and be successful in more conventional terms. Um, and I appreciated that. And by the way, I think I honored their wishes ultimately, but I took a bit of a circuitous route to get there. But I did it my way.
Yes.
But so I wanted to play music from a very young age, um, and somehow it just never happened. And then when I was around 10 or 11, I begged them to let me learn piano. I was just totally into sort of honky tonk, New Orleans style piano, and gospel and that kind of thing. God knows where I heard it or what made me sort of latch onto that. It was just something I really loved about it. And but my mother was like, absolutely not. You've got to concentrate on your schoolwork and everything. So I got to the age of about 13, and I'm like, I'm gonna play music. I just am. And so I just went out and I bought myself a pair of drumsticks and I bought myself a practice pad. In fact, I think I just bought some drumsticks and a pair of brushes. I used to sit there on one kitchen chair and play drums on the other kitchen chair. And then in the end, my mother said, "Oh, you're actually pretty good at that," and I'd play along with the radio. And then I had a job. Back in those days, you start work as young as you wanted. Really, I started I think when I was 10 or 11, something like that, with a paper round. And so I paid for lessons from the best drummer in town and in Christchurch, New Zealand. And and then one day he offered me a drum set for £60. And I had £60 that I'd saved up. And I'm like, I could have bought a car for £60 or I could have had the drums. So my logic was I'll buy the drums because then I can make more money playing drums and then I'll have money to buy a car. And in the meantime, I can get my father to drop me off. And anyway, I was too young to drive anyway. So now I think about it. Although in New Zealand you could get your license when you were 15, so I wasn't far away from being able to drive. But so I bought this drum set. I think I bought it on like a Monday or something like that. And I mentioned it at school, and these other kids at school had a bit of a band together. They didn't have a drummer, but they did have a gig that Saturday night. So incredibly, and I'm incredulous as I say this, but it is true. I actually played a gig, sort of 6 days after I got a drum set, and all I'd ever really played on prior to that was the kitchen chair. It
Yes.
went all right, and we got paid.
Blimey, that must have been a light bulb moment, really. Sort of, you could see the future, really, couldn't you, at that stage?
You're totally ruined. Once you sit up on any sort of raised platform or not, and you play an instrument and people applaud and get excited, and then especially if they give you money at the end of it, that's it. I mean, there's nothing else. That's all you're doomed. You're sucked in.
And what was it? And what's it like? Because you were obviously at that age where you were very conscious of that 60s period happening and, probably kind of getting excited about all the albums and thinking this is just normal, even though you look back and think, oh, there was a lot of good music. But then, when 69 comes along, you had the death of Brian Jones, and then the following year, the death of, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, Jimi Hendrix. You had that kind of Altamont, Charles Manson period. I mean, the 60s and the Beatles broke up. The 60s did end on a bit of a downer, didn't it? Did you feel a little bit like, oh, that was going to be, we were just about to launch into life and now it all feels like it's a bit unstable, or did that not affect you?
No, it did actually. It's a good point because I actually I had gone to Australia in 1970. I was in Australia all year in 1970, and my goal was to come back with a band. And my goal was to come back to New Zealand, see my parents, grab some extra stuff, and then go to England because that was sort of the holy grail at that point. I wasn't even looking at America because, as far as I was concerned, all the great bands came out of the UK. And that period, as you mentioned, from 62 to through 69, really most of the great bands were coming out of the UK, although, as you mentioned, Janis Joplin and Jim Morrison, people like that, they were American, and I was heavily influenced by them. By the way, I thought Big Brother and the Holding Company was amazing, and Janis Joplin, I still think one of the great voices of all time. And so, I arrived back in New Zealand, and somebody said to me, "Would you be interested? Would you consider staying in New Zealand?" And I said, "No, no, no. There two bands that if they asked me to join, I would join. And but that's never gonna happen. And I swear within 24, 48 hours, the phone rang, in those days you had one phone, two if you were like, I think we had one in the hall and one in the kitchen. Phone.
Blimey, well, mostly people went to the phone box. They didn't even have a phone in the house. That's quite
Well, we did
unusual.
we didn't until we emigrated to New Zealand, but we had one in New Zealand. You're absolutely right about that. And so we the phone rang and my mother said, Peter Dawkins. And Peter Dawkins was the top producer in New Zealand at the time, and I knew his name. And I said, "You're kidding me." So I picked up the phone, and this voice said, "It's Peter Dawkins here. Would you be interested in joining the Quincy Conserve?" And that was one of the two bands that I'd mentioned. They were the top band in New Zealand. And I said, "Oh, come on, stop screwing around. Who is this?" And he goes, "No, no, 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 this is Peter Dawkins." He says, "Would you be interested in auditioning?" And I said, "Well, yeah, when?" And he said, "Well, like, I don't know, tomorrow or 2 days from now, something in Wellington," which was, a flight from Christchurch. So I said, "Sure." So they sent me a ticket. I jumped the plane. I went up there. I did the audition. At the end of the audition, they said, Do you want the gig?" I said, "Yeah." And boom, I was like immediately into this whole new thing. I canceled. I suspended my ticket to England, and um, and I joined this band, and it was like 6 nights a week and the biggest club in Wellington, New Zealand. And also, we were the house band for EMI Records, HMB recording studios in Wellington. So I immediately was plunged into this whole career as a studio musician, which was something I really wanted because and through this period, I'd really become excited about the studio players, like the Wrecking Crew and those people. And
Yes, Carol Kay.
yeah, exactly. And I think I was blessed with a good ear, and which is probably what led me into producing. And I could hear the sort of the precision, the accuracy with which they played. They always played in tune, they always played in time, they played with great groove. There was just so much going on there that I could identify. I didn't necessarily know what it was, but I knew there was something special happening. And it was one of those things where you would hear a record and you would kind of know who was playing on the record just from not only from, the kinds of notes they played and everything, but just the sheer sort of accuracy and precision by which they played and the groove that they played with. But so I wound up staying in New Zealand for that extra year, and then we won this big award, the National Entertainment and Ballroom Operators Association Award, which said we were the best band in New Zealand. We also were in this Luxing Golden Disc Award, which was on television, and we had a bunch of hit records over that time. And the leader of the band had said, "Well, we're going to tour Australia and then probably go to England." And I thought, this is great. And then at the last minute, he reneged on that. Well, I'm barely 21 years old. And so I said, "I got to go." So I quit the band like in early December 71, and I boarded a ship, which was the ticket that I had put on suspension a year earlier, and went to England.
Right.
And then to your point about did I feel like, things had gone horribly south, I've always said we landed in Southampton on, I don't know, it was late January 1972. And I said it was like they slammed the door shut on the 60s as I, went down the gangplank off the boat. Um, it just felt like the 60s had ended. And England was a rough place at that time. It was I can't remember if it was actually the Heath Cup at that moment, but shortly afterwards it was. And we wound up with miners' strikes. We had power cuts every
Yes, so there was. I think it might have been when Heath did that one, when he sort of addresses the nation. And he looks very serious. And so I'm going to have to be honest with you. Christmas is coming, but it's going to be very bad this year. You're going to have to cut backs, which no politician would dare say now. But
No,
it was quite
no.
interesting in those days. And then we had,
Yeah.
yes, the 3 day week. And I don't know if you can remember that period, but I remember. In the paper, you'd get a sort of a little timetable of when the
Yeah,
electricity would go off, and you'd have to sort
100%.
of kind of construct your day to this moment where, up, the electricity's gone, candles come out, odd, very dangerous
That was
looking
very,
lights
very
would appear
good.
on the kitchen table, and you sat there in
Yeah.
dark for a few
We,
hours.
I lived in a bedsit in the top in the attic, so the garret in Earl's Court, and we had a shared kitchen and a shared. No, we didn't have a shared kitchen. We had just like a sort of hot plate, and but it was a shared bathroom, and the best thing you could do would be fill the bath up with hot water right before the electricity went off, and sit in the bath for as long as you could until it started to go cold. It was so damn cold. You could not stay warm, and there was no way to stay warm. There was no
No.
were no gas heaters. There was
There was
no
no
coal
central
fires.
heating, single
Coal was
pane.
bad. Yeah,
But
coal fires
you
were
know,
bad
with
around
this
then.
band Quincy though, but you were on one of their albums, weren't you? The one which
Yeah,
is,
I
and
would
did
have to
you
find.
write one of the songs, Someone to Find? Was that yours?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I can't remember which one it was now, but I wrote one of them. Yeah, and it was in fact it wasn't the first song I wrote, but I had written a song when I was 14, and but you know that basically we were making the album, and the leader of the band said, "Does anybody have any songs?" So I went home and I didn't really, I never had piano lessons, but I had a piano. So I sat down at the piano. My view is how hard can it be? And that's sort of how I approach everything in life. And of course, usually it's way harder than you thought, but then you persevere with it and you get there. Um, I wrote I think two or three songs, and I presented them to the band. And we recorded two of them, um, and I guess one of them made it on the album. So, I was the only one that showed up with any songs, which was hilarious. I was the least able to write a song, but I did, and yeah, it was interesting.
So
Uh,
72, you're in London now, and then
yeah,
sort of you've gone there. I mean, this is when, glam is almost at its
100% at its peak. Yeah,
it's happening. It's bizarre, but I've had a bit of a moment with the Rubettes recently, sort of various
right,
members of the Rubettes, but also, I mean, David Bowie's got Ziggy Stardust coming out.
absolutely.
Had you just started discovering interest in clubs around Soho and the nightlife of London at that stage?
Well, I was not really because I actually was playing in all the clubs. So like for me, I was playing as many nights and as many days a week as I could. So I arrived in London, and funnily enough, I wound up with about, you know, uh, I don't know, more than a dozen albums that I'd played on in the year that I was a studio musician in New Zealand. So that kind of opened a lot of doors. It actually got me it got me a scholarship at Berkeley, and I was there for a while. And then when I was back in London, it opened doors because the one thing with studio work is it's kind of a catch-22. You don't get hired as a studio musician unless you've been a studio musician. So
Right.
you have to lie about it or you have to cheat your way into it somehow. But fortunately, I had these recordings that I'd made in New Zealand, and they were good. Peter was a really good producer, and they were great artists and great records, and so that opened the doors. And then there was a couple of New Zealand artists in um, in England at the time, and they knew who I was, so they got me to play on their records. And from there, I would meet the producers and the engineers, and then you get recommended for other records. And thing is, I was young, and I had really long hair, I had a beard. I had a very modern sound. And, my drums sounded like drums sounded in those days, and a lot of the studio musicians were older, and they were great players and really great players. But some artists prefer to have someone more their age and who looks cool. And
Yes. Did you ever meet Mickey Most or Tony Visconti at this time?
well, I know Tony quite well. I mean, I worked with Tony a lot. I played on many recordings for him. And Mickey, yeah, I met him many times. I've worked at Rack Studios a lot. In fact, one of the bands I was in, Easy Street, we actually won television. Actually, we weren't the ultimate winner, but we got down to the final. I think we were pipped at the post by somebody else, and there was a technical reason why we were pipped at the post, called New Faces the show. It was
Oh
kind of
yes.
yeah, it
With
was
that with it was that Howie Green?
I,
Who
I can't remember. Mickey Most was a judge. I know that. Mickey Most was like Simon Cowell on American Idol. He was the sort of Simon Cowell of New Faces, where he could be very disparaging. But we did all right. We actually won every heat all the way up to the end. And then it turned with but by then we had a record deal with Polydor. And I think as I understand it, one of the conditions of being able to win was that you could sign to Mickey's label, and we couldn't. So we didn't get selected at the
Yes, that was
final.
tricky. Did you, because you mentioned Deep Purple and obviously the birth of heavy metal at that stage with, Black Sabbath, Purple, and then the heavy sounds with Led Zeppelin. And then there was also the prog rock period, which was kind of
Right.
musically quite interesting and challenging.
Yeah.
Did you enjoy people like, is it Alan White or Bill Broomford, who was in Yes, or Phil
Well,
Collins in
I
Genesis?
actually, so I was in that scene as well because when I was at Berkeley, I got deep into odd time signatures, and I was really, really good at playing odd time signatures. So I actually wound up getting recruited to play in a band called National Health, which Bill Bruford had played in right before me, but he was overcommitted with several other projects. So I wound up playing with National Health. But at the same time, I was working with my own band, Landscape, and I couldn't really do both, because Landscape was starting to take off, and we wound up with conflicting. I mean, almost all through this period, not only was I doing studio work during the day from like 10 till 6, sometimes till 9 or midnight, but I was also playing as many gigs as I could. Sometimes they would just pick up gigs on the weekend just to make money and just be playing my instrument. But many of them were actual, touring gigs. And I was playing with as many as 5 or 6 bands at the same time. I'd
Yes.
sub for a lot of drummers, where they were sick or they couldn't make it or their girlfriend was mad at them or whatever it was. And it was a great experience. I mean,
And how did you meet? Because you met, was it Ken and Peter to form Easy Street as a three-piece? Was this,
so I
were
met
you,
Ken Peter because I was working with this New Zealand uh, uh, artist, and his producer was a guy who worked for CBS Records, called Paul Phillips, and Paul's brother-in-law, Pete Thorne, was the bass player in Easy Street, and Paul was also the producer of Easy Street. But I think that's how Pete Thorne got into Easy Street. So Pete, um, Pete Marsh and Ken Nickel, were the sort of the core writers and the core of Easy Street, and so they invited me to play on some of their recordings, and then it went well, and they invited me out on tour, and then they invited me to join the band, basically. So I was in that band simultaneous with being in Landscape, and that was a little bit tricky, but Landscape was what we referred to as a Monday night rehearsal band, where, we were very weird. We were really just experimenting with the weirdest kind of stuff we could think of. The idea was how far out can we get? And it was that kind of period of time, because like you say, it was prog rock period. I wouldn't describe us as prog rock. We were somewhere in the sort of jazz fusion um, area. But we were pretty individualistic. Like we had a basic rule, which is if anybody in the band says that sounds like, we would get rid of it, whatever it was.
right?
Have to
Yes.
go.
Did was it tricky finding your tribe at that stage with Easy Street? Because there was the pub rock scene with people like Doctors of was it Doctors of Madness with Richard Strange, and there was Doctor
Yeah,
Feelgood. Obviously, a lot of bands being with Doctor as a title, and then suddenly you must have been, oh my God, the Sex Pistols, the Clash, the Damned. Were you aware of that kind of being in London, thinking, the
very much
Malcolm?
so. I mean, so like actually, that was kind of the story of the end of my membership of Easy Street, really, because I said to the band as we were making the second album, I said, "Look, we're kind of this West Coast easy rock. Um, and frankly, that era's over. That's kind of emanates from the late 60s, early 70s, the Eagles, and I love that period, by the way. I mean, it's not disparaging that period at all, but things have their time, and you can't be of another time, really, unless you're totally of another time, like, you're somebody, who's reviving Frank Sinatra type stuff or something like that. You can occasionally someone can get away with that, but mostly not. So I said we really need to sort of toughen up our sound and everything. I said basically the songs remain the same. And one of the examples I used was actually Elvis Costello. Look, Elvis Costello, everyone regards him as new wave. He's not regarded as punk, but he was regarded as new wave. And I said they're basically just the same kinds of songs we're writing, but the production techniques are more rough around the edge. They're a
What
little more
Nick
aggressive.
Lowe really, wasn't it?
Nick Lowe, exactly right, and the stiff records and all that. And but they didn't want to hear anything. They were really into the Beach Boys and James Taylor and the Eagles and everything else. So I actually got kicked out of the band,
Well, it
and when
was
I got
interesting you mentioned Elvis Costello because I was just thinking his first band wasn't the Attractions. It was a band called Clover that I think had Huey Lewis on. And they were one of those kind of American soft bands who just like must have gone, does anybody want to hear this record? It's like, well, we've got the Sex Pistols, we've got the Clash, do we
Yeah.
want to hear? And there was people like Niels Lofgren and a band called Spirit with Randy California. And it was just like, that time has, like you said, that ship has sailed, hasn't it, really?
Well, it sails overnight. When it sails very, very quickly. And I've always been sort of tuned into that. I've always been fascinated by that, how trends happen and why they happen and what causes it to happen. Um, and I'm not saying I'm not suggesting I could manufacture it, but I definitely can recognize it when it's happening. And I mean, that's one of the things that's enabled me to make a good living most of my life, really, is by sort of I hear things and I know immediately. I'm the same way I see things too with fashion. I see something and I immediately know that this is the beginning of something new. And I'm not sure where it comes from, but I'm like super observant, both
Yes.
orally and visually, and also I think maybe philosophically as well. Um, so I think I knew that that period was over. So, I pushed the issue too hard, obviously, with Easy Street, and they kicked me out. But it was probably the best thing that could have happened. I mean, undoubtedly the best thing that could happen to me. So I went, okay, what are my options here? And I had landscape, and I'm like, well, I'm just going to pour all my efforts into landscape. Now, we were kind of a jazz fusion band, but then I started writing songs for landscape, and first song I wrote for landscape, and I never, I wrote songs for Easy Street too. I never primarily thought of myself as a writer, though. I always thought of myself as a player. And but I wrote this piece called "You Two Time Me One Time Too Much," which is written in kind of mathematical language, like U two X, yeah, me one X, and um, and um, and that turned out to be super popular. We play that live, and people would just go nuts. And it still had sort of some jazz influences, but it was much more rock. It was much hard. It was very hard. And
Yes. And that was 77, wasn't it? There wasn't
yeah,
anything else that sounded like that at the time, really.
no. Well, by the way, you mentioned, do we find our tribe? The answer is no. Because we couldn't get arrested. We like the whole pub rock scene, or Ian Dury and the Blockheads, who I love. And there were tons of bands that were the pub rock scene. I thought we're perfect for the pub rock scene. Nope, they would not hire us. We didn't have a singer, we didn't have a guitar player. Like they just weren't interested. So how we got going, I'm like, well, we'll just do it ourselves. So I said, let's just find a pub somewhere that's got a nice little stage, and we'll just put on our own gigs. It's like Mickey Rooney, let's put on a party in the barn, and we. I found this pub called the Stapleton in Crouch Hill, and the story, as I always tell it, was the first time we went there to sort of check it out. There were like four Irishmen and a dog, and nothing happening. And so we went to the publican and said, "Look, it's obviously a slow night, Tuesday night. Why don't we come in and we'll play? You'll pay us like £35, and we'll pack your place out." And so we went in the first week. I don't know, we probably put 40 or 50 people in there. Well, we were there for a year, and at the end of the year, I think there were 800 people there. I mean, the place only held about 150, so it was a summer's night, and they were spilling out on the street. The reason we left was because the publican wouldn't pay us any more than £35, and he was making bank. He was really doing.
Yes.
Um, and so we said, look, we can't keep doing this for £35. I mean, £35 wasn't that terrible in those days. It was actually, you know, pretty decent going rate, but it was nowhere near what we were generating for the pub. So at that point, we kind of, went on the road all over the country. But that we really sort of had to create our own tribe and had to find our own space.
So
And then
who was your tribe though? Who was kind of tuning into your sound and your image as well? Because it was quite
well,
strong.
funny enough, there's this gigantic I never would have guessed this, but there was this very significant um, contingent of girls from the Camden School for Girls, or Camden Girls School. I can't remember what it's called exactly, which was, I think, a private school, but either way, they were pretty sophisticated and they were young. and they came and they just loved the man. And of course, if you fill a place with girls, you fill a place with guys very shortly after, you know. So I think
Yes.
I think our tribe really was the sort of the disaffected, you know, the people who feel like they don't fit anywhere else,
I
which is
guess it
kind
was it wasn't it didn't have a kind of a bit of a yobby atmosphere, did it? It was
no, we don't.
your sound
We,
wasn't sort of your
uh,
it wasn't Sham 69, was it? Let's
we
face
were
it.
definitely not yobs. We were definitely not hooligans, soccer hooligans. We definitely no. I mean, more power to Sham 69. I remember them very well. In fact, they were on. I think they were on ICA, maybe when we were at some point. But yeah, I mean, no, we definitely weren't that vibe at all. And I mean, if anything, that was our downfall in a lot of ways. We were very cerebral and pretty sophisticated and sort of almost academic. I mean, I'll say this: we this was I don't know if this is relevant at all, but it's the only band I ever played in at that period of time where nobody smoked. And
And this is the 70s. It was
this
almost
was 70s,
mandatory.
everybody smoked. I mean, when I was playing with these other bands, we'd be banging down the M1 and the M40 and whatever, the M whatever existed back then. And I'd be in a Ford Transit van, and that was the only one not smoking. I mean, you could literally like cut a square foot of smoke out of the
Well,
out
I
of
know.
the atmosphere.
I still have memories of the staff room in the 70s at school, and every teacher was, they were all
Oh yeah,
smoking. You would just see this kind of this room, through the
right.
door of everybody having a fag in the staff room, and it's
It's
like, God,
crazy.
it was. But I was asthmatic, so I could never get
Same
there.
with
But,
me. Yeah.
so
I'm not asthmatic, but I can't get my breath when people smoke. Even to this day, if I walk down the street and someone's smoking across the road, it will take my breath away.
yes, I
I
know
can't
that's
see.
I have the same reaction and thinking, God, I used to go to pubs and we used to go to restaurants and cinemas and have to live with that as well as
I every
it's a
gig I played, I mean, I'd come home and my clothes would reek. I'd have to put them outside or in the washing machine or something because even just the smell of clothes soaked with smoke was enough.
yes. Well, it was
Make
in the unless you washed your hair, it was on your pillow the
I
next
had to,
day.
I had to wash my hair before I could go to bed because I went to bed with from a gig.
Young
You
people would have no idea
right.
what we're talking about here, would they
No,
really?
no,
But
I know, I know. I mean,
yes.
it was such a I couldn't believe it when they banned smoking in pubs and bars, and especially like in France and Italy and places like that. It was just amazing. But
Yes. But
you
then
know,
so we had the Silver Jubilee of 77 and things started to shift quite quickly. And
yeah.
punk, before we knew it, was starting to kind of get quite sort of poor at that stage as well. So people were desperate for a new music scene. But in 78, you hadn't got an album, but you got a John Peel session. How did that come about?
Well, because we had our EPs out. We were a DIY band, and which frankly we kind of got that from punk, really. Although we didn't sound like punk, we had the punk ethos, which is we created our own gigs, and we made our own records, and we put them out. We distributed them like we distributed through Rough Trade and Lightning, which was in the Harrow Road, which was one of the big punk distributors, and labels like Beggars Banquet at the time, as it was called, distributed through Lightning and through Rough Trade. And literally would drive around with boxes of records in the back of the car. And anywhere there was a record shop, we'd stop and we'd try to sell them a box. And if we couldn't sell them a box, we'd leave a box on contingency. And we'd come back, next time we were passing by and take whatever they hadn't sold and get the money for whatever they had sold. So it was a very DIY kind of thing. So I think, and we were inundating, the BBC with this information because we all loved Peel and all those, there were a lot of great shows on the radio back then at night, that were not the mainstream, you
Tommy
know,
Vance.
right, exactly, all that stuff. And so we built, good relations there. I mean, we did another one at BBC World Service as well. I've forgotten who did that, but that was at Bush House when World Service came out of Bush House. And the Peel session, I think, was in the basement of Broadcasting House, which is still on Great
I think
Portland.
Maida Vale 4 and
Oh,
your
Maida Vale
producer.
4, yeah,
So
you're
it was
right, you're right.
Malcolm Brown was your producer. So were
Right.
you all adapt in the studio? Had you sort of
Oh
when you
yeah.
went
Yeah, so Andy myself and Pete were all studio musicians, and Chris and John were excellent musicians as well. So it was really no problem for us, and we could go in the studio. We were all like first take players, and so I actually, when I listen back, I mean, like, I don't know if you've seen the Old Grey Whistle Test video.
Yes, I have.
Yeah, I mean, my recollection at the time was it didn't sound that great. I listen to it now and I go, holy shit, that sounds pretty good. And I mean, that was just like one take, really. I mean, that's you didn't get a second shot at it. You did it and that was it. And so yeah, but when you're out playing all the time like that, you don't even think about it. You just do it. And
And did you get picked up by RCA quite quickly?
yeah, which was a blessing and a curse. So when that happened, we were a democratic band, and
Oh,
we took
how did you do the voting then? Did you have to have complete consensus or majority? Because there was five of you.
majority. So three voted for the RCA deal, and two of us voted against. I voted against, and I recall John voting against. And the reason I voted against was because I'd been signed to, I think, four major labels at that time. RCA was the fifth. And then finally I was signed to EMI in 1983. EMI in America, EMI America, Capital actually in America. And I just knew I'd been through the mill four times already, and I knew how badly things can go wrong with the major label. And when it goes right, it's amazing. But when it goes wrong, as it mostly does, it's really a drag. You wind up with a bunch of tracks that you love tied up with a label that doesn't care about them, and doesn't doesn't do anything for you. It doesn't do anything for them. They're not listening. They're not promoting. They're not doing anything at all. And so my logic was we're making quite good money. Um, making our own records and selling them at gigs and selling them through stores. If we keep going like this, we'll be able to fund our entire career. And I maintain that, yeah, had we done that, I think we'd still be playing probably, or we would have still been playing for many, many years, because there was no reason to stop. Um, but on the other hand, if we had have done that, we probably would never have gone made the turn into really hardcore electronics and computers. We wouldn't have written Einstein a Go-Go. We wouldn't have, recorded songs like European Man. We probably wouldn't have been, actually, we were part of the Blitz scene because Japan was getting played at the Blitz before even the first time I went, and which was like the second time the Blitz happened. But so yeah, I mean, I think there were pluses and minuses. I mean, to this day, I see the pluses and minuses. It's like, yeah, okay, so we
Yes.
had a couple of substantial hits, which we wouldn't have had probably as a DIY act. But on the other hand, I think we would have built a much stronger business and probably you know had a lot of fun touring and making records and basically being our own bosses.
Yes, because 79 is kind of interesting period, isn't it? Because that's the year Thatcher gets into power. And then the 1980, we have, the Falkland War. Then there's the miners' strike and Greenham Common. And so you're playing this kind of like quite futuristic music. Did you sort
Yeah.
of manage to find a tribe at that stage? Because there was quite a few little clubs started, hadn't there? There was, I think the Bat Cave had started. There was one called, is it Alice in Wonderland? There was also then the Blitz Kids. Did you start getting picked up by a bit of a London art scene group?
Yeah, so see, when I first came back to England, I needed a gig badly. And so I played with this Irish band called the Bernie Egan Trio, which was a husband and wife duo that I played drums with. And I actually had a bass player who I was in a band with that was signed to Warner's. And I brought him along, but they weren't gonna pay more for the bass player. They paid £5 a gig. So I said, well, fine, I'll take the £5 and I'll give my friend Wayne 250 and I'll take 250. So I just didn't want to play without a bass player. And also he was my friend. And we were in it together kind of thing. And when I wanted to get out of the band, it was difficult because, I mean, I enjoyed playing with them. They were lovely people. Bernie and
Mm.
John, just the salt of the earth, funny as all hell. And we played all the IRA pubs at the time of the bombings in London. And I mean, John used to say, shut your fucking mouth. He says, don't say a fucking word. Don't let them know your English. And and so I just sit there and play, but we were playing all the Irish rebel songs, like 40 Shades of Green and things like that. And when I wanted to get out of the band, it was not easy. It was not a sought after gig. And they had I think he was 14 years old, son called Rusty Egan. So I taught Rusty to play. I gave him, I mean, Rusty was kind of naturally talented, but I gave him some, lessons, and he took over the gig. And then we stayed in touch. And so he used to come out and see Landscape. And when he started the Blitz, because it was him and Steve Strange that started the Blitz, he called me. He goes, you know, you gotta come see my club, Rich. And so you know, said Tuesday night, 10 o'clock. So I showed up, and sure, my name was on the door. If my name hadn't been on the door, I wouldn't have got in, because I didn't realize you had to dress up. I didn't know what it was all about the first week. And I go in there, and it was like, holy shit, this is my tribe, because he was playing Japan and a couple of other things we'd put out there. He was playing, Bowie, the stuff you love, and what Rusty did was he put together this kind of, he curated a playlist of songs that created a whole sort of electronic sound that didn't really exist in the world. It existed, like there were songs out there like Popcorn, there was Wendy Carlos, so there was, the German bands Kraftwerk and Can, and there was Bowie. It was kind of sort of
I suppose
not
Had
really.
Van Gelis come out as well at that stage, and he'd done some amazing stuff. Did he do Midnight Express? Oh, that soundtrack. But
Yeah, I think that was oh, there was Jean-Michel Jarre, there was and then Bowie did Ashes to Ashes, but not at that point. So I think Low was the closest thing to sort of an electronic album that Bowie had made, which I loved, by the way. I think side B on Low is just crazy good, but I have really weird taste in music. And So I walked into that club, and I'm like, holy shit, this is it. Like I said, I knew right away this is a new movement. And I went every week. I mean, which was hard for me, because I was a studio musician. I was in the studio at 10 o'clock in the morning. And as a drummer, you got to be there at 9, because you got to
yes,
make sure everything's set up right, and so on and so forth. I mean, by then I had a road crew and everything, so my drums would be there and it'd be set up, but you still had to adjust everything, and, just be comfortable, because it's downbeat at 10, and downbeat really was at 10. And so, if you're in a club till 2 or 3 in the morning, and I was usually the only one that had a car, so I'd be dropping people off at 4 a.m. around town, because the night bus service was so terrible back in those days. And um, that was my tribe, really. I mean, and suddenly I realized I was just in the right place at the right time.
yes,
And we were making the next album, the Two Rooms of Mars album. And I was talking to these guys at the bar, and I didn't really know who they were, but they were nice. And I was telling them we were working on a record, and one of them said to me, can I hear some of it? I'm like, well, we just have rough mixes, but I actually have some in my car. My car's right outside. I had this BMW, because I was doing pretty well, as a musician. And I used to just bump it up on the. I don't know if you remember when people used to park like that in London. You just bump it up on the pavement, on the sidewalk, on double yellow lines, and you wouldn't
yes.
get a ticket. And so we went out and we sat in the car, and I played him some. And then I think the next day or 2 days later, I get a call from this guy, Steve Dagger, who I had been talking to. And it turned out he was the manager of this band, which was called Spandau Ballet. And he asked me if I was interested in producing the band. And I said yes. And it went from there. And I honestly didn't think I'd get to produce the band, because although I was very well known as a studio musician, and I was becoming well known as a musician around town, I didn't really have any experience producing other bands. And I know Spandau by that time was starting to become, nobody had heard their music. I had heard their music, and about 50 or 60 other people at the Blitz had heard them play, but most people had not heard them play. But there was this whole thing going on in the music press. They actually had sort of peaked success-wise, and now everyone was dissing the band, and no one had heard them. And um, and
Yes.
So, but there were tons of producers that were vying for the gig. And for whatever reason, Chrysalis decided that I should do it. And I think partly it was because they knew me, from my work with other bands and as a studio musician. I think I had a good reputation for being punctual and responsible and a good
Yeah.
musician.
Well, it's interesting because a few weeks ago I did an interview with Mike Howlett, who was in
Yeah,
Gong and
I
lots
know
of
Mike really
bands.
well.
And
Mike's amazing.
he became the producer who worked on A Flock of Seagulls and
Absolutely.
also Martha and the Muffins and
Mike's
Orchestral
amazing.
Maneuver, a lot of those kind of classics. And it's like this psychedelic kind of bass player who was playing sort of way out
Yeah,
music became this kind of go-to producer who, again, had that kind of zeitgeist moment in that making those pop songs of the early 80s, which then come on MTV, which then, they I was always curious why America was so big on A Flock of Seagulls. And it's like, well, when MTV started, there weren't any videos, but they had one for
yeah.
A Flock of Seagulls. And they said, I'll just stick this in the rotation. And
That's how
so
it worked. I mean, it
everybody
was
got,
all. Yeah, I mean, like we had like there's a Norman Bates was on heavy rotation the minute um MTV started. The problem is our records came out a little bit too early, like 79, 80, 81, and MTV didn't start until 82. It would be better if our records came out in 80, like Kajagoogoo and bands like that. They really did well because it
yes.
came out exactly coincident with
And
MTV.
what
So
was when you heard Laurie Anderson's Oh Superman, did that excite you or inspire you at all? Because that was quite different, wasn't it?
I was kind of by that time I was kind of pretty embedded in the New York scene because I'd been coming here with Spandau Ballet and with Shock and these other bands that I was producing, and so I knew like Jim Farrat, who's one of the co-owners of Danceteria, and so I was pretty plugged into the kind of New York downtown scene, and Laurie Anderson was very much a part of that. So I had seen her. I didn't personally know her, but everybody I knew her. I mean, I remember having lunch with David Byrne with my A&R person from RCA Records, or dinner actually with David Byrne from Talking Heads. And I'm on the Sound Exchange board with David now, but it was I sort of immediately plugged into that whole downtown scene when I
Did
came
you
here.
did you like those stuff, the things that came out on a label called Z Records? Because that was quite a
Yeah,
eclectic mix, and Brian Eno brought out a collection compilation into
yeah.
new wave, no wave kind of bit, which had people like James Chance on it, and was it DNA and Liquid? So the New York post-punk scene had a much more eclectic sound, didn't they? They were bringing in jazz and African beats and South American beats as well. So it was very different to Sham 69, basically, wasn't it?
Well, I mean, New York at that time was much more of a melting pot than London. I think London's.
Did you ever go to Studio 54?
I did, yeah,
And did
and
you enjoy it?
no, not really. I mean, the sound system was staggering, and I mean, it's like it's beyond anything you can even imagine. I mean, it was just, I remember standing there once. I understood records I hadn't understood before. It was these little dinky kind of drum machine type records of the time, which was like the CR 68s and 78s, which sounded pretty crappy. But when you play them on those systems, they sound stunning, and so it made me appreciate certain aspects. But the whole disco scene had happened in New York, and the sound systems here were just mind-boggling. And then beyond that, I think Area was my favorite club, which only existed for about 4 years. The Blitz only existed for like 18 months, and
Yes.
there were other clubs.
Did you go to the Mud Club in New York?
Yeah, I did all of them. I did CBGB's. Breaks my heart that that's now a John Barbados fashion store. I think it should have been a museum, really. Um, but yeah, I did. I mean, part of the problem. Well, I moved to LA from New York because I feared I was going to die because I couldn't get any sleep. I would be in the studio all day. I was producing and doing remixes here, and then I'd be out until 4 or 5 in the morning at clubs, and back in the studio at 9 or 10 in the morning, and even sometimes I'd be in the studio all night, and then I mean, the big clubs opened. There was the after hours clubs and the after hours clubs that would open at 7 a.m. It was crazy time in New York City. Insane.
Yes. So when you had Einstein came out, was that a massive surprise to the band because and having that sort of chart success because at the time there was those singles that just came out like Mickey from Tony Basil and just those kind of fantastic, very instant hits, weren't they?
Yeah.
Did that surprise the band or did it discombobulate the band, sort of dealing with a top five single?
Not really, because we made Einstein to be a hit, and we always believed it would be a hit. I mean, I remember saying, because we were a complicated band, and I remember saying, what we need to do is make a song with three chords and cartoon-like lyrics, that is accessible, but that has a deep, dark intent. Because it's actually a protest song. It's an anti-nuclear, anti-religious, bigotry um, song, and it was like 20, 30 years before anybody seemed to identify that's what it's about. But the idea was, bury the meaning inside this kind of jokey kind of little cartoon-like ditty, as it were. And we actually had to fight with RCA for that to be the first single. And we were right about it. Um, I think there were other singles on the album that should have come out ahead of Norman Bates, which is actually my favorite track on the album. And I actually didn't write that song. But I think Shake the West Awake should have been the follow-up to Einstein. But at that point, we sort of, that's the problem with being signed to a major label. You don't have control over your destiny.
Yes, because I think David Bowie had been on RCA, but he'd signed over to, was that, well, he'd signed to EMI for Let's Dance, didn't he?
Yeah, that's right.
So once that came out, because I was just saying, what was it like when you had sort of a hit, a track that you were hoped to be a song? Because you were saying the intention was there, but obviously you can never completely guarantee it. So was it when it became this kind of massive hit and sort of became a sort of a global success? And I'd mentioned about Mickey by Tony Basil, and there was I don't know various other. I Came to Dance by Men Without Hats. People who just have that song that suddenly get in the top 10 quite quickly. What was it like for the band after years of playing, but then suddenly having such chart success?
Well, it was kind of essential, really, because, like I say, we signed with RCA, and after having significant success with our EPs, we had the two EPs, You Two Time Me One Time Too Much, and Workers' Playtime, and we sold tens of thousands of those gigs. I don't know the exact number, but a lot, and that's what led to the deal. And I don't think RCA ever really understood the band. But they saw the success, But so we signed to them. We made the first album, which was basically all the stuff we were playing live, like Japan and um, you know, Mechanical Bride, and some really great material on that first album. And the first album, I don't remember the exact numbers, but did much worse than our live EPs that we were doing. Um, that we had made ourselves. Now, I mean, it was recorded at Utopia Studios. It was, professionally done. Whereas our EPs, I used to record them on my Revox with a couple of mics. But the band was so good and so well balanced at the time that the live recordings, sounded incredible. And but it was very disappointing to see what happened. So we had a two-album deal, and RCA went ahead with the second album, irrespective of the fact that the first album hadn't done so well. And we were picking up a lot of traction at the Blitz because Japan, as I mentioned, was a big track there, and we were very much part of that scene. And then I'd been asked to do Spandau Ballet. Um, but that was subsequent to us producing the Tea Rooms of Mars album. I think I mentioned to you that I'd played some roughs from the Tea Rooms of Mars album, and that along with just getting along really well with Spandau Ballet and generally a good vibe with them. They then out of that asked me to produce their first um, album, their first singles and album. So we were sitting around thinking about making the next records. I'm jumping backwards and forwards in time here because this was before I did Spandau Ballet, but I recall it was Christmas, and we were just messing around with stuff. And we had this one track that I had written called Route Nationale. And we were sort of thinking about how we were going to record that. We'd rehearsed a bunch of this stuff. And I remember calling the band. I can't remember if we did it in a meeting or it was done over the phone or whatever. But I remember saying, if we make another instrumental album, it's going to go the same way that the first one did, because they just don't know how to promote this stuff. And there really was nothing on the radio at the time that was instrumental. Everything was vocal. And I think we're going to have to kind of do something different. So we used to have like these weekly band meetings. And so we got together and talked it through, as I recall it. And we decided we weren't going to actually add lyrics and vocals. And the conversation went along the lines of sort of, well, who do we get to sing? And several of us had had experience in bands before, and the general opinion was that singers are gigantic egomaniacs, and they wind up sort of dominating the band, and then they usually wind up leaving the band and leaving the band kind of with nothing, nothing left, basically. So we decided we'd do the vocals ourselves, and none of us had actually ever sung on a record before. Um, and I don't think any of us thought we were particularly good singers. Um, but we did it, and that sort of became the core of it. 'Cause, like, we just don't want to introduce a new personality into this band that's been together now for probably 7 years, something like that, in various different, iterations. So we sort of worked out our internal dynamic, our internal personality dynamic. Um, so with that, we were putting together everything, and Einstein was one where we like I said to you before, we wanted to make something, or I wanted to make something. I think we were on the same page. We had an amazing amount of sort of synchronicity in those days. It was incredible because I kept thinking, well, no one's going to go along with that idea, and then suddenly everybody did. It seemed like we just had this kind of like a flock of birds, where you just keep turning in the same direction all the time. You don't really know quite what the navigation principle is, but somehow it worked. And so, everybody agreed, yeah, we should add vocals and we should add lyrics and we should do all the vocals, and we agreed to share the vocals. I wound up taking the lead on quite a lot of them, but actually, if you really listen to the album, everybody's singing something, some
Right.
parts. We wound up adding harmonies and God knows what else. I mean, the other thing is the band, they're really good musicians. The other guys are really, really good musicians. And it was a highly competitive environment as well. So, in a positive way, like we were just always challenging each other to stretch a bit further and to do more and, to go further out and be better and all that kind of thing. So, you know, I mean, I'd written a lot of articles, we were all pretty literate. I'd written quite a lot of songs with Easy Street, and I'd written, songs before that, as you mentioned, with Quincy Conserve. So writing wasn't alien to me at all. Writing lyrics and stuff wasn't alien to me. So that's where it went, and then Einstein, as I mentioned, was sort of like, we thought, let's write something that's a really serious topic, but it's kind of lightweight ditty kind of thing. So it would sort of disguise the gravity of the topic. And the title came from I think a Christmas card, I think that our designer, John Morica Le Breton, sent to John Walters, and it just had Einstein a Go-Go on it. I think John thought that was a really cool title. And then he came up with that melody that was so catchy. And the do 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 do, that one.
Yes.
And from there, originally it said, better watch out, you better beware. Einstein says, and I said, it'd be better if we just said Albert says. So we went with Albert. And then I think I wrote like 20 verses to come up with the actual two verses that we wound up using. Um, and it was a time when there was, the revolution happened in Iran. You had the Ayatollah making very threatening noises about, this, that, and the other. We had the whole sort of nuclear scare that happened in the early 80s, and there were all these books coming out about what you should do and how, if the USSR launched
Yes.
or not out of 10.
Duck and cover. Oh, when I think there was
Well,
When the Wind Blows as well, Raymond Biggs or Briggs.
right. And there was On the Beach, that movie that came out, um, about the submarine that was the last survivor that was traveling around the world trying to find any trace of human life. Um, and Duck and Cover was a very American thing. In Europe, the received wisdom was, well, we have 5 minutes. If they launch, we've got 5 minutes basically to sort of, kiss your ass goodbye. And in America, I think they had 20 minutes with the
Yes.
Continental Ballistic Missile launch. Um, so, it all sort of tied in. Oh, the other thing that was out there at the time that was a part of it was this, there was a, this is obviously before the web, before the internet, before the dark web. But there was a blueprint that was floating around in this kind of alt sort of revolutionary world for a briefcase nuclear weapon. It'd be like a dirty bomb,
Yeah.
you could just put it somewhere in a city and it would destroy several city blocks and basically irradiate the entire city and make it impossible to live there. And so that was all part of it as well. It's,
Yes, I know it was an interesting time because Thatcher had just got in '79, and there was the Falkland War, then the miners' crisis, and Greenham Common, which ties in with the whole thing about nuclear threat. So politically, the '80s was feeling quite grim at that stage as well.
Yeah, and then there was the fiscal side of it as well, where, suddenly a lot of the sort of social, um, you know, um, the social web basically that protected people, that prevented them from falling through completely, was starting to be reduced. I mean, it continued to be reduced since then, but there was a general feeling that things were getting rougher if you're at the bottom end of the social scale.
Yes, the net was slowly getting eroded. But looking back on it, it was still pretty amazing that people, yes, generally people didn't fall through if they could just about hold it together at some stage. So yes, yeah. So then, how did the band go? Oh my God, you can't believe what's happened. It is a hit because at the same time, I don't know if you've ever heard that sort of recording of the Trogs in the
Yeah,
studio with
yeah, it's amazing.
sprinkle fairy dust on the thing.
Yeah, yeah.
Did you sort of think when you play back, yes, that is gold, or who knows, is it going to work? Are they going to love this as much as I don't know, whatever was in the, Shaky
I mean,
Stevens, Bucks Fizz, the Nolans. I mean, the charts were full of some really
yeah,
easy stuff, wasn't it? And some big hair started to appear.
yeah, I know, yeah, absolutely. And we obviously had pretty big hair at that time as well. I think so. I always thought that it had the potential to be a hit. One of the things, having been a studio musician, um, and been around studios a lot and different people, and I've worked with all kinds of. I've worked with some of the best producers in the world, and I've worked with some of the worst producers in the world. And one of the things I really hated was people would go, "It's a fucking hit." And I go, in my mind, I'd be sitting there thinking it's not a hit until it's number one in the charts or in top five or top 10. And so I always hated that sort of sense that something's a hit because, there's tons of great records that get made that, should probably have a shot at being a hit and maybe even should be a hit, but they just don't have that shot. There's so many factors that, you know, come to play and making something a hit record. It's kind of impossible to calculate. Um, but this was an interesting thing. So I had produced Spandau Ballet. Um, we finished, the Two Rooms of Mars, and I pretty much went straight into the studio and did Spandau Ballet. And I finished to cut a long story short, I don't know, first week of December, I think it was, something like that. And they actually delivered it like on a Monday, and it was a hit like 10 days later or something like that. I don't think I'm exaggerating there. And because Chrysalis really got behind it and they wanted it to be a hit for Christmas. Um, and I realized that we'd stand a better chance having a hit with Landscape if we waited until after the Spandau Ballet stuff had really sort of bitten in. So we didn't release Einstein until early in the new year. And it actually worked really well. because I suddenly by that time I'd been on Top of the Pop, or had been to Top of the Pop several times with Spandau. I'd been to Top of the Pop many times before that because I played on a lot of hit records previously, but never in my own capacity. And but I knew all the people like Peter Powell and that were the DJs that could make a difference, and they knew
Yes.
that I had produced Spandau, and so that definitely got us an extra look. Um, in terms of the Radio One playing it, and Radio One at the time was absolutely essential, and Top of the Pops was absolutely essential, and so
Yes.
yeah, so the record came out, and records in those days used to start quite low down the charts. They could start in the hundreds and sort of jump up the charts, and this was jumping up pretty well, and it got to my recollection is 41 in the chart, and or 39 or something like that. No, maybe it was 32, but I can't remember exactly. But anyway, it got somewhere fairly far up the chart. And the question was, would we get Top of the Pops? And there's a certain moment with Impetus where if you don't get Top of the Pops and you didn't keep moving up, the record would just drop out. Everybody
Yes.
would lose faith in it. The retail stores wouldn't stock it. At the time, there were many stores that only stocked the top 40. And if you're the worst positions to be in were 41, 31, 21, and 11. You always wanted to be in inside the top 40, the top 30, the top 20, the top 10. But so my recollection is that we were somewhere in the top 40, and the question was, will we get Top of the Pops? So our um, our uh, our manager at the time was talking to White City, which was where Top of the Pops was shot then. And, we were in the studio mixing something. I've forgotten what it was now, but he came back to us. He said, no, they're only going down to number 28. Yeah, I'm pretty sure we were at 32. And he was sort of pretty dejected. And I said, well, why don't you go down to White City with the 1 inch video because that's the professional grade video which we had a copy of, and just wait there because I've been on Top of the Pops a lot, and I said what happens a lot is that somebody gets stuck in Milan in the fog and doesn't make it, and they have a slot that opens up suddenly, and if you're there, they'll there's a chance they'll take you and they'll take our video. And normally the first week in Top of the Pops they won't play the video. You have to go on live the first week, but well, it was mimed. But you had to be on there in person. And so anyway, he went down there, and sure enough, somebody got stuck in I think it was Amsterdam, and you know they don't have much time to sort anything out. They would have called like 3 or 4 artists before us because we were 3 or 4 artists below the lowest position they went down to, and but anyway, they put our video on, and boom, it happened after that. It just shot up the charts. And then we did it. We went on the next week, and then we did the video the week after, and I think we went on the week after that. And that was the way it worked. They wouldn't do the video 2 weeks running. I don't think they would do live 2 weeks running either.
No.
So worked out
Yes, I
amazingly.
think the same thing happened to Bowie, didn't it? I think he got the call and can you get down here and perform? And they quickly cancelled everything and got down there, and the rest is history, really, isn't it? So yes, so that was it, the big hits. Then yeah, so that obviously is a giddy moment of excitement. So what's it like to do the third album? Always a bit tricky because doing this show for quite a few years. Most bands have a bit of a 5-year narrative, the 12-month honeymoon period, being of an indie kind of kid, I suppose. They would get a play on the John Peel show. They get the John Peel session with Dale Griffin, at the Maida Vale studios. They get that first album, the little kind of tour around the countryside and the cities of East of Britain, in the transit van. Then that second album, things are getting a bit better, but the tensions in the band. Third album, the band, about 5 years in, the band are wondering where all the money is, and they all hate each other and say, "Oh, forget it, I can't be bothered. We didn't enjoy it." So, what was it like for you on this kind of journey of your third album?
So it was a bit of a different trajectory for us, and I think so. What happened really was that we were really, we loved being out on the road. I mean, the band was amazing to play with, and we did I don't know somewhere between 200 and 300 dates a year for 3 years. We were working, 4, 5, 6 nights a week. And it was incredible. And, at the end of that time, and that's when we did the Norwich Ballroom gig.
Yes, good old
Was
Norwich was on your archive.
exactly. And that was, that I think the band was really at a high point then in terms of our sort of being together and being well rehearsed. I mean, one thing, by the way, is we had my recollection is we had over 100 active songs that we played. We would cycle them through. So we still have a huge library of things that we recorded back in the day at live gigs, but never put out. And so hopefully one day we will put those out. Hopefully soon we will put those out. But the Tea Rooms album changed everything because, John had seen this new machine, the MC8 microcomposer, and he told me about it, and he was raving about it like it's incredible. It's like a composer's tool. So I went and saw it, and I was pretty well off at the time because I was, doing really well as a studio musician. This thing was super expensive. It was £5,500, which at the time, was about half the price of a house in London. And but I'm like, this is amazing. We locked ourselves in the warehouse at Roland for an afternoon when they were having their Christmas party, and we messed with it. And we came out of there and was like, we have to have this. And so I bought one, and we had a whole bunch of, by this time I had a pretty big synthesizer set up in my studio in Camberwell, and we made the record, so this how the Two Rooms of Ours album became really the first album made by computer. Um, the whole thing, for the most part, was driven by the MC8 microcomposer and was very synthetic. The problem with the MC8 microcomposer is it would only hold about 3 or 4 minutes of music um, for a full track, and it took 45 minutes to back it up to a cassette player and 45 minutes to um,
Yes.
reinstall another track. So it made playing live impossible. So we basically stopped touring. And I think in many ways it was the worst thing that ever happened to us, but it was not easy to see at that moment in time how to get around that. We could have played the stuff live, but we had never played the stuff live. The Two Rooms album was sort of like Sergeant Pepper's. It was kind of a creation of the studio,
Yes.
And and so we never sort of went through that disillusionment period. We just stopped playing live. And then really what caused the band to come to a grinding halt was that RCA insisted on going with Norman Bates for the second single, which I never agreed with, although it is my favorite track from the album. And I never agree with it because I've always kind of followed the sort of Motown formula of it's the same old song. You make your second single should be very closely related to the first single. And then the third single, you can start to make a change, but you've got to sort of consolidate your fan base, and it needs to be kind of recognizable as being, when it comes on the radio, you should know, oh, it's that band Landscape that did that Einstein a go-go thing, and that wasn't true with Einstein, with Norman Bates.
No, it's a
But
very odd song, isn't it? It's a little bit creepy and disturbing.
well, it was meant to be. I mean, it's based on
Yeah,
Psycho.
okay.
It's Norman Bates,
Yeah, I know, I just said the
and
obvious there, didn't I?
yeah, yeah, no, you're right. But I just didn't think like I said, I love that track. I mean, there's nothing I don't like about it, and I think ultimately it could have been really successful. But this is what happened. We made this video on 35 millimeter black and white film at great expense. It was 50 stock. And I persuaded Pamela Stevenson to star in it. And she looks remarkably like Janet Leigh from Psycho. And, the direction and the production of the video, I think, is amazing. And it was incredibly expensive. Um, and the week of release, the promotion department at RCA, to their great credit, had, as I recall it, 11 television viewings lined up, like 11 shows on British television lined up. Now, my experience, that would have made the record would have gone straight in top 10. And then right before um, the week started, at the end of the prior week, we got a call saying somebody at the record label forgot to clear the video with the Musicians Union. And we were all members of the Musicians Union, like longtime members of the Musicians Union. So all of us who had any sway there, I think it was pretty much all of us, um, called the Musicians Union and begged them to, give it special permission. We said, look, the only people you're going to hurt here is our musicians who are members of the union, because RCA will just go with whatever the next record is. It doesn't matter to them. And yes, they lose a hit, but it's just one of many hits to them. For us, this is not only losing our next single, but it's potentially losing our entire career. And because, if you don't follow up on your second single, life gets a lot more difficult. So, but they refused. They just said, no, absolutely not. And so none of the 11 showings happened. And the record went into the chart. I think the highest it got was somewhere around 40, like 41 or 39 or something like that. And then it dropped out of the chart. Well, it wasn't a complete failure, but it wasn't enough of a hit to say that we had consolidated our success. And then the label didn't really want to go with another single. And we might have gone with European Man again, which was the second
Yes.
time we released it. Um, but once you lose momentum, it's really, really difficult. And radio sort of goes, well, the last one we played wasn't a hit. And so we don't want to play it again because they always want to play hits. And we were a pretty weird band. We weren't Bucks Fizz and we weren't Dollar and we weren't all those other bands that were out there at the time. Um, and we didn't want to be Bucks Fizz or Dollar, by the way, absolutely not. Um, and so, you know, that was it really. And we went to make the third album, and you know, we really did our best, and I think it's a really great album in so many ways. In fact, I sort of for many years had a bad taste in my mouth about that album, like, oh, we didn't get it right. But actually, when we were working on the box set, I think there's a lot of good stuff on that record that would have had a shot, but so much of it's to do with, impetus and, like I said before, all these kind of multiple factors that come to play in having a hit single. It's not necessarily just about making a good record. It's about, impetus and getting the right promotion and having the press behind you and so on and so forth. And by the way, the British music scene at that time was moving incredibly quickly. And, so like 18 months is a long time in the music industry, but it was really a long time in the UK at that time. And so like the trends change,
Yes. Well, I
and
was thinking there was two producers, wasn't there, who also, alongside yourself, who started to appear, which was Trevor Horn, who bizarrely, I think he produced the first Dollar album or single, because
he
I
did.
spoke to the woman from Dollar who said yes, that was her who persuaded him, who'd never done anything before. So there was here Trevor Horn and then his sound, and also Robin Miller who did Sade and that Everything But the Girl and that slightly more jazz stuff, and then there was Working Week. So there was those two fractions as well as all the other indie pop stuff, but they were definitely the sound that the started to shape the 80s kind of charts, really, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, so I'd worked with Trevor because I played on the Buggles album. Actually, I played on the Buggles demo of Video Killed the Radio Star, and later I played on the Buggles album, and also worked with Robin too. So I know both of them really well, and yeah, they do great work. I mean, obviously Sade was sort of it's funny enough, I was asked to produce her group, which was called Pride, I think, and but I don't think they ever got signed. I think what happened was CBS wanted to sign them, was talking about signing them, but in the end, I think they just signed Sade. And but so with, what I found is that I noticed in my career that anytime Trevor was having success, I was not having success because he's very, very pop in his productions. It's sort of bright, sparkly, clean. And I'm not. That's not my vibe at all. And
Yes.
so it was kind of like when that trend was happening, my trend was not happening. And that continued, through the 80s. and after landscape when I just went on to become a producer.
Yeah.
So
Well, I have to say, you know, I find the Trevor Horn production sound has dated so much, and I find, whenever you go, oh yeah, I like that song, then you start listening to it after a few minutes, it's like, actually, I'm not that keen on it anymore. And David Bowie, interestingly, had some of his albums from the 80s remixed and taken out that kind of a shine or that sharpness, which found it quite sort of soulless, really.
yeah, I mean that's sort of I always tried to keep things much more organic and um I don't know, I was more influenced by R&B and funk and those kinds of things. And so, my productions were generally more drier sounding. They didn't have tons of reverb. They weren't these sort of shiny, sparkly pop productions. And even Einstein, if you listen to it, has very little reverb on it. Chant number one's the classic example, and that has virtually no reverb on it. It's such a dry record. Um, it's not like I was obsessed with no reverb. I wasn't, but I just tended to like things that were more I don't know, authentic, I suppose, not so
Yes.
manufactured. And and that's not a criticism of what they did. Obviously, what they do is amazing. I mean, actually, I think the Sade stuff's incredible.
Oh
Uh,
yes, God, I love, I think that hasn't dated too much because it's kind of quite, it's got an organicness to it and the vibe. But when you hear ABC, Frankie Goes to Hollywood, Tina Turner, and even some Dire Straits, it feels a bit sort of harsh, really, a bit sort of much,
yeah, well, that was
really.
the classic sort of what people associated with the SSL sound. I mean, I used SSLs, but I started on Neves, and I was much more of a sort of a Neve type of person. Like I like the warmth of that. But Um, yeah, I mean, it's one of the reasons I moved to America was because I really wanted to work on more sort of R&B type stuff, that kind of thing. And the first thing I did when I moved to New York was the Colonel Abrams stuff, and I
Oh
really,
yes, Trapped. Now, so has the band finished at this stage after that third album, or did you have another little chapter which was quite short-lived with just a few members?
yeah, there was the Landscape 3 with just the three of us. Um, we 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 did do that. I think we did that late 82, maybe early 83. But I I had I moved to New York in 83. I was actually about to move in at the beginning of the summer, and I got a call, an enigmatic call saying, asking me if I was available. And I said, well, I might be, but it depends. And it turned out it was Adam Ant, and he wanted me to do the album Strip in Stockholm at Polar Studios. So I wound up doing that and postponing my move to New York. I moved to New York, at, in September 83. I'd been there in just right before the summer, but I postponed it, as I said, in order to do the Adamant album. But then when I moved there, I was asked by the person who was representing me at the time and person who was representing Colonel at the time, if I would make a demo for Colonel because they wanted to get a deal for him. So I did. I went into Right Track Studios in New York. And I only had three instruments with me in New York at the time. All my other instruments were back at my house in London. And I had a Lindrum, a Juno 60, I think it was, and a DX7. And so I made that record with that because I didn't have any budget at all. I just went into the studio and did it. And the demo was actually what came out. That was actually the record. It wound up getting him a deal on MCA, and that was actually a really big hit. It wound up being a gold 12-inch, which they were pretty rare at the time. And I think it was number one dance 12-inch
Because
in
he'd
America.
released the single called The Truth and then Trap. You did Trap, didn't you?
Yeah, I didn't do Truth. I did all the singles though. I did Trapped, I did I'm Not Gonna Let, and I did about half the album. But Trap was the first one. I mean, I think he had singles before that because Arthur Baker had him on his label.
Right. God, I actually, confession, I did buy the single. Even though I was an indie kid, I thought it was such an awesome record.
Trapped.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, actually, one of the favorite moments in life. There's not. not many of these happen, but I was walking through Times Square one day, and Sly and Robbie, I ran into Sly and Robbie, and they said that groove on that record, it's just unbelievable, you know. And if Sly and Robbie tell you that a groove's unbelievable, you know you've done something good, right?
Yes, because I used to go and see them at, on the university circuit because they used to do things called the Taxi Gang, Sly and Robbie, and they'd have a guest vocalist. They'd often have three in one evening. So if you were lucky, you'd get Maxi Priest or, I don't know, Yellow Man or Gregory Isaacs or one of those people, Half Pint as well, I seem to remember. They were just the most awesome nights, and they had that electronic drum sound that was just, which he would just whack. And I always remember they'd be on stage for about 3 hours and you'd see the roadies kind of holding the drum kit together because they whacked it so hard. It was just
Yeah,
awesome.
yeah.
It
Well,
was,
he loved the SCS-5, funnily enough, so um, that was another connection with them. But I think, and actually, I worked with Robbie a lot later. But those guys were amazing. I mean, in my wildest dreams, I never imagined that I would get a compliment for a groove from Sly and Robbie.
yes, they were absolutely
Like one of the high
amazing.
spots of life. And
And when did you, because then you started working with people like Five Star as well. Was that a bit later on, or was that
I did Five Star at the beginning of 86. So
right?
I was going to do them in New York, and I had gone on a trip to New Zealand. Um, it was actually my honeymoon, and while I was in New Zealand, I was thinking about it, and I looked at the weather in New York, and it was so cold, and I thought, I'm bringing in five kids from Romford. And, even though England can be cold, there's not like a New York winter, and this was a really severe winter. So I called up, and they were on RCA too, and I called up RCA and I said, why don't we just do it in LA? It made no difference to them. I mean, it was same airfares basically and same studio costs. So I wound up just flying back and going to LA, and it's actually how I wound up moving to LA. Um, I went there and I did the Five Star album at Larrabee Studios on the corner of Larrabee and Santa Monica. It's not there anymore, but yeah, I mean, I had met with them when I was in England before. This was one of those interesting things. So I asked them who their influences were, and I thought that they were going to say, my Jackson 5 or something like that. But they said Duran Duran, which was really funny. And it really changed my perspective on how to produce that record. But they were amazing, actually. I mean, Denise had the most amazing voice, but they were all really incredible, the harmonies they did. And, they would do all their dance moves while they were actually in the studio.
Yes.
Really incredible group. Unfortunately, they got kind of screwed up later. They didn't have all the successes. I mean, they were hugely successful.
It's
That,
because
that,
I've bizarrely, it's kind of interesting because I had a slight, not argument, but a bit of a tetchy little moment because there was obviously a lot of the 40th anniversary of Live Aid, and there was this, who should have been on the bill, who shouldn't have been on the bill, and someone said there was not enough black artists, and I thought, well, who could they have had who was big at that time? And someone said Five Star, and I was like, I can't remember Five Star being big, but they were big, I guess, weren't they?
Well, they were. I mean, they had a big house in Sunningdale. I mean, I think they at one point, their net worth, it doesn't sound like very much now, but I think it was 13 million pounds was reported in the Sun when they eventually went bankrupt. And they just made a few mistakes. But that's the story of the music industry. I mean, unfortunately, it's kind of like people who win the lottery, they very often go bankrupt, right? And I think unfortunately in the music industry that happens because, you get people who've never really had a substantial amount of money, and they don't necessarily, they didn't go to schools, and they don't have families that are used to managing money. And so they mismanage their money or they mismanage their career, and boom, before you know where you are, they're broke again. I think, it's a difficult thing, The other thing I noticed with a lot of artists, I mean, you sort of gave that trajectory before, which is sadly very true. Um, but a lot of artists I've worked with, once they have success, there's a feeling that this was preordained and it's going to last forever. And I've always said to artists I work with, if you get 5 years, you're doing really well. So make sure you pay your taxes and save your money and invest it. And they never
Yes.
do.
No, they think that I guess it's like when people think they can do the formula and they go, well, this worked, and then it does if they're lucky, and then think I'll be able to repeat that formula, and it's like, as most people have said who I've interviewed have said, it's kind of luck and timing. Obviously, the product or the songs that they've got are something, but at the same time, it's that kind of chance moment, that chance play. I mean, I did an interview with a member of the German band Nena, who did 99 Red
I
Balloons.
know, well, yeah.
And it was the drummer who I interviewed and also the producer as well, which was, I was a big, but then it was kind of interesting, the story, because it's like, well, how did that become such a big hit? And one of it was because I spoke about that German film called Christian F. And
Yeah.
I don't know if you can remember, it was set in Berlin. It was a, woman who turned to drugs and prostitution. Well, the woman who wrote that novel that it's based on was in LA with Rodney, the famous DJ
Yeah.
in LA. And he
Mhm.
said, "What's hot in America, in Germany?" And she pulled out a cassette of that single in German and played it. And suddenly it was like, everybody was like, "My God, that's amazing." And then people in New York are saying, "Well, why aren't we? That's on our label, but we don't know anything about her." And it's like, that's a hell of a chance moment, if that is true. But I don't know why that guy would have told me a fib.
No, I think it probably is true. I mean, I had a situation, for instance, when in '82, when MTV started up, um, I was in New York quite a bit over that period, and I flipped on the TV, and Einstein and Norman Bates was on MTV, and then I dug around a little bit, and I found out it was on heavy rotation on MTV early on. So I went to RCA. At the time, they were on 44th and 6th, and I said to them, "You realize, you know, Norman Bates is on heavy rotation on MTV. We should get it out again." And the response was, "MTV doesn't count. There's only has 1 million viewers." I went, "1 million viewers is first off is a lot of viewers," but I did check on that, and actually at the time it had 2 million viewers. Now there was no radio station in America that had that kind of viewership, but also anyone who had MTV was a devout in those early days, they were devout music fans, because it was the most amazing thing. I mean, the first couple of years of MTV in America it was breathtaking because we would just be like video after video after video. There were hardly any commercials, if any commercials.
Yes, well,
And
because I was always curious why A Flock of Seagulls was so big, and they said, well, they had a video of the single I ran,
yeah,
and they just didn't have many others, so they kept playing it, and
no.
thus it becomes very popular. And it's like, well, okay, that's amazing. That just seemed to be a little moment in the 80s, but that's still being played quite a lot now. And yes, interesting. Interesting. I did an interview with the producer of that, who was in Gone, called Mike Howlett, I believe. And he
Yeah,
said it
Mike's
took him
incredible.
such a long time to get that guy's vocals right. It was absolutely, it nearly killed.
That's the secret of being a producer before auto tune. I mean,
Yes,
and that wasn't always true. I mean, like Colonel Abrams was a one-take singer. In fact, Trapped was one take. Denise was too, although Denise was a perfectionist. I mean, I'm a perfectionist, and usually I'm the one to say, no, 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 we can do it better. But very often I'd say that's it, and Denise would go, no, 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 I can do it better. And usually when artists say that, they're wrong. And back in those days, you didn't have unlimited tracks, and you very often only had one track to do the lead vocal on. And so, if you wanted to do another take, you had to wipe the one you had. And but so you really went over if you thought you had a good take, you didn't. You went over it with great trepidation, and
yes,
but Denise was almost invariably right. If she said she could do it better, she could do it. She did it better. Um,
amazing. So
yeah,
how do
no.
you how do you navigate your 90s? Then the 80s is obviously a very golden period for producing. What's your 90s period? Because obviously the landscape of music changes again. And I think
Yeah,
one of the things that really happened, which kind of knocks out a lot of the bands I loved, was Ecstasy came along. And then
yeah,
there's a new wave of 16 to 18-year-olds, and they don't want to listen to a band who've on their third or fourth album because they almost seem like old hat, don't they, who have lost the plot and are singing songs about how terrible it is to be so famous and having so much money. When you're 16, you don't really care about those sort of ideas. So then, you had, that electronic music like all the orb and orbital and 808 state and music, and then you had grunge coming in from Seattle. So how did you navigate that period?
Well, a couple of things. One is, I'm not sure if you're aware, but European Man is the first record to go out under the banner of EDM. So, it was released in 1980, and we gave it the catalog number EDM1. And on the back cover of the single, we said EDM, electronic dance music, computer programmed to perfection for your listening pleasure. And that we've never come across any prior use of the term EDM. In fact, it really was 4 or 5 years before the term EDM started to be used more widely. But I think you put your finger on it with ecstasy. There was and I don't know how this holds up, but I saw a study on, sort of brain patterns on ecstasy, and apparently what ecstasy does to your brain, it makes sort of your brain kind of go around a repeated kind of cycle. And I think, that makes sense to me because what music really changed at that moment in time, it became incredibly repetitive, because prior to that, you wouldn't take a 1 bar loop or a 2 bar or a 4 bar loop and make that pretty much the whole song. But that did start to happen with EDM. I actually had no problem adapting to different things because, I'm a musician, and so I listen to what's going on, I learn, and it's not hard to figure out how things are done if something different's being done. I always prefer to be at the front end of everything, so I'm not copying anybody else. Um, but it wasn't hard to hear that they were using 909 bass drums and 808 snares and things like, and so it was pretty obvious. And if you knew anything about synthesis, you could hear a record and know what the sounds were being used. So it wouldn't have been that hard for me to adapt. But I actually got really ill in '89, and I had this misdiagnosed kidney problem that lasted for 3 years. And then when I started to come back into producing again in like 81, sorry, 91, um, I was meeting a whole new generation of A&R people. Generally, I was 23, 24, 25-year-old A&R guys, and they were all guys, who had their claim to fame was EDM basically. And their thing was, well, you're Mr. 80s, and well, I was also Mr. 70s. I can also be Mr. 90s, it's not that hard. And but I never really got a foot in the door. I did produce an album by a group called Praise, which was an ambient record, and we did it in Q Sound, which was an early sort of two-speaker surround sound system, which was absolutely amazing. And I'm very proud of that record. It's a really good record. We had a top five hit off that record, um, but at that point, I started to realize that I don't know if I want to climb this mountain again. So I did a few more productions and some things that were, reasonably successful. But once you've sort of been to the top of the mountain, you don't necessarily want to climb it back up again. So you know the route, it's like that's boring. Um, so I went on vacation to Maryland, in the US, and my ex-wife was from there originally. And I stumbled across a whole bunch of bands when I was there, and I realized there was this whole new scene happening in America, which wasn't really happening in England. It was very interesting to me. It was kind of alternative rock, I mean, I was familiar with Nirvana that had happened. And this was sort of post-grunge, really. And so I found this band, Jimmy's Chicken Shack, and I was going to produce them and get them a deal. And then I realized, you know what, why don't I just manage them? So I decided not to produce them. And I got them a record deal with Rocket Records, which was Elton John's label, um, on Polygram. It was, and ultimately through Island Records at the time. And and we had a pretty big hit with the first single, High. It went top five, I guess, active rock in America, and
Yes.
and they were touring like crazy and doing really well. So it was like a whole new phase of my career. And at that point, I had a management company, an agency, a label called Foul Records, which, which these records were originally were on, but we upstreamed them to the major label because at the time, radio promotion in America was extremely expensive. I mean, it costs $100,000 to promote a record to a genre format like active rock or alternative rock, and it would cost $500,000, 500,000 to cross it over to what they called CHR, contemporary hit radio at the time, pop radio, basically. Um, so, it was pretty difficult as an independent label to put up that kind of money. I mean, you could do it once, but you couldn't do it if you got it wrong. It definitely hurt to lose that kind of money. Um, so the best thing was to kind of upstream to a major label and have them spend the money, which we
Yes.
did. And that sort of launched a whole different phase of my career, managing artists and running a booking agency and a label, and
Yes.
something I really
Did you
enjoy.
listen to the production sound of that kind of rock pit decade? Because it was just kind of interesting. There was definitely a different, like you had, potentially, like say Trevor Horn or Robin Miller, and then in the 90s, American rock, which I kind of feel like got really more and more harder and aggressive.
Yeah, it
Ending, I
did.
don't know if you've seen the film Woodstock 99, where it's just
Yeah.
like, oh my God, it's a weekend in hell, ending badly. And that kind of draws a line under a lot of that scene, really, doesn't it? Because it was
Yeah.
depraved, really. But then that production sound, what did you think of those sort of big records that came out during that decade?
I actually really liked it because, by that time EDM had gone round and round and round in circles and it was sounding very familiar. There's that whole semitone chord move, that dun, 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 that was kind of, you know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
Early 90s house music and stuff like that. And not that when I first heard it, I thought it was amazing. I mean, there's some incredible records that came out. I think that Snap record, what is I Got the Power? I mean, there's just some, there's no form of music I don't like. It's just there's usually a couple of good examples, sometimes many good examples of that music, but there's usually a lot of crap as well, or stuff that I can't appreciate. Let's put it that way. But I really liked the rock stuff. And the interesting thing was, in the 80s, when I first moved to New York, I worked at Unique Studios. I can't remember, it was at 47th or 49th Street in Times Square, basically. And I worked with a couple of young engineers called Tom Lord-Alge and Chris Lord-Alge. Actually, it was Chris Lord-Alge initially, and Tom, his younger brother. And there's a third brother who ultimately ran their rental company. So I maintained those relationships. And then what happened was they were the ones that were really behind, they were the remixers for all of that stuff in the 90s. I mean, there's hardly a hit in the 90s of that in the alternative and active rock format that they didn't remix. So I actually got them to mix the Jimmy stuff. Tom Lord-Alge remixed the Jimmy stuff. He's an amazing, amazing remix engineer. And
Yes.
it's a particular style, very, very heavy compression, and sounded incredible on FM radio in the US. And so, I actually really liked it. It was just a different. I get bored really easily, and I can't keep doing the same thing over and over. And it's kind of a curse because I tend to walk away from things right when I'm doing really well with it. But
Yes.
I got to keep my mind alive.
Well, it was interesting because I did an interview with another producer from that period, Michael Binhorn, and he
Michael,
did.
I love Michael. So let me tell you this. So, Black Hole Sun is
Yes.
one of the greatest records of that era, and I've told Michael this many times. That's Soundgarden, and oh my God, what a great record! By the way, archetypically that sound. I mean, he really nailed that sound on that record. I don't
But it
know
was
if you-
interesting because he kind of again he shapes a lot of the 90s sound because
Very much.
he does all those big records. But I did sort of say to him, it's interesting, you did their big hit of the big album, but and that was the big success they had. but you never did the second one. He said, well, we didn't have a great time in the studio. You know, people would bring me songs. I'd say, this isn't good enough. Come and write, go away and write more. So he sort of said there was a lot of tension, but he wanted to get the best out of the artist. That was what he drove at. But it was not going to mean that he would get asked to do their second album or the follow-up album, which was quite an interesting way of working, wasn't it, really? Yes, intense, probably.
Well, I think that's part of the lot of the producer, really, is that, you're there to get the best out of the artist, but often they don't want to hear it, And I mean, I heard that I had a reputation of being really tough in the studio, and maybe I did. I don't know. I mean, I'm somewhat of a perfectionist. Um, I like to do things quickly. I like to get things done quickly. I'm not somebody who will go to 80 takes, and some of the people we spoke about earlier do like to do hundreds of takes, and I
How did
think
you
it's
get on with people, especially drummers, often, which I found, struggle in the studio? The pressure starts to
yeah.
get to them. They're not getting it. They're not nailing it. They're not playing to the click track. You know, everyone's getting tense and tetchy. You know, there's a big, there was quite a story about the drummer with Hole who just couldn't get it, and she leaves the band, and he gets somebody else in, and then she has a story where she, becomes a junkie and lives on the street, and then has a film and a book made out. But it was kind of in. Oh, are you still
That's all
there?
right. I'm still here. Yeah, I'm still here.
So
I
I
was
just
just
wondered
joking.
how you sometimes could deal with situations like that where there's a lot of tension and things aren't quite working for the artist.
So that's a great question because I was a studio musician for many years, as you know, through the 70s. And one of the things I was asked to do many times was replace drummers on records. And so I'm on a
Hmm.
lot of records that I'm not credited for because, you know, it would have been embarrassing for the drummer in the band to not have their name on the record. So I would go in and do the drums, and they would they would give the credit to the drummer in the band, which I was fine with. And but I always had a high degree of empathy for drummers because I would go into the studio and the drummer would be sitting there pretty dejected. You know, the producer had sort of said, you know what, you're not cutting it. I'm getting a studio musician in, and they would call me or somebody else, and you go in there and my heart went out to these guys. I felt for them. I mean, I understood they hadn't trained themselves to play to clicks, and from the early 70s through, you pretty much had to play to a click, especially once remixes came into the game because you couldn't, cut a section out from the end of the song and put it at the beginning of the song if the tempos were really different. So I really felt for those guys. So when I started producing, I made a rule that I wouldn't replace the drummers. I mean, the many times I've worked with drummers where I could have gone in the studio and played the part in one take. And they weren't that complicated, these parts. And I could have nailed it in one take, but I never did that. There was only one instance when I actually did do the drums on a record, and that was with the first King album, with Love and Pride, because the drummer they had at the time just wasn't making it, and the band decided that they wanted to move on, and and they didn't have time to get another drummer. So I actually played on that record, but then they subsequently got Steve Lillywhite's brother in to become the full-time drummer in the band. But so I did everything I could to sort of encourage the drummer to do it and get it right. And I would even use all the studio tricks like punching them in, which had previously not been possible in the 70s. But when the Studio A800s came out, you could actually get in and sometimes get out on drums if you needed to patch a little bit, if they got most of it right, but some of it wrong. Prior on the Studio A80s and the other machines that were out at the time, you couldn't get in and out quickly enough because of the gap between the record head and the playback head.
Yes.
And so, but I like a good example is Spandau Ballet. I mean, John Keeble had never been in the studio before, and it was definitely the first track we did. Was somewhat challenging for him, but by the time we got through to chart number one, which was only about 2 or 3 months later, I mean, we made that record pretty early on. Um, that was one take, literally one take. He played it, and he's a great drummer. It's nerve-wracking when you go in the studio the first time. So I think maybe because I was a drummer myself, and maybe because I had to crack that nut myself at one point in my career, I hope I was encouraging to drummers. I hope I was, you know, somebody who helped them,
Yes.
to
I
kind
know,
of get
and
their
I
mental
know a lot of
state.
people who had their John Peel sessions at Maida Vale with Dale Griffin often had some challenging moments because he was obviously a drummer himself and probably found it quite hard work. But there's been so many interviews that I've done where, there's been issues with the drummer. And there was a film from a Leeds-based indie band called The Wedding Present who did an album, George Best, and the producer, they wanted the sound that they got the producer, and just hated the drummer. And yes, the drummer got removed, and there was a band called the Go-Betweens where they were all in relationships, and Lindy wasn't cutting it, and her I think Robert was the partner, and he was in this position of like, this my relationship, but this is my band. And basically the producer said, look, this is what it could sound like if you do it like with a studio produced musician, which will be a great hit, or you stick with your partner, and that's just going to be not good enough. So lots of challenging moments there, really, in lots of ways.
Yeah, I mean, I did a remix once for a band, and I won't say who it was, but they sent me the multi tracks, and I put them on, and they were all over the map. They were just really bad, and the playing, was just all out of time, and sometimes out of tune. And actually, I brought in studio musicians, and I replaced all their parts, but I wrote out the parts, and they played the parts that the musicians had played. And when I played them the final mix, they're like, "Wow, we sound so good," and I was so happy. They never realized it wasn't them. Um, and
Yes.
I mean,
So,
nowadays you could do that. Nowadays, everybody does that just with the computer because you can just quantize everything and you can auto-tune everything. And, ostensibly it is the original musician, but it really isn't because they really didn't play it that in time. But back in those days, if you couldn't play it in time, it wasn't going to be in time. And if you couldn't play it in tune, it wasn't going to be in tune. There was just no way around that. Uh,
yes. And then in the O years, did you then have another change of direction in your career?
in the 2000s.
Yes. What
Yeah.
happens in that next decade?
So the next decade what happened was I was running this management company and everything was good. And I was in Maryland, just outside of DC, or sort of equidistant from DC and Baltimore. And I got this offer to go to Smithsonian Folkways recordings. And then this takes me right back to the very beginning of my career because they had they had the Lead Belly collection and they had Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee, Lightning Hopkins, some really, really important early blues stuff, but also things like Woody Guthrie, This Land Is Your Land, Pete Seeger. Not a big Pete Seeger fan, but he's definitely an important figure in the folk revival period of the late 50s. Um, and so I thought to myself, I'd never worked for anybody, honestly. I'd always just been, my own boss working for myself, doing, producing and being a musician and everything. But I thought, why not? This could be really amazing. I can't turn down this opportunity to work with that collection. And so I took the job, and stayed there 14 years, interestingly, which I probably stayed there too long, but it was definitely a fascinating job. And I wound up out of that producing their Jazz, the Smithsonian Anthology box set, and the Smithsonian Anthology of Hip Hop and Rap, and quite a few other bits and pieces. I wound up engineering some stuff in Venezuela, which was interesting because it was the first set of sessions there were under Chavez. The second set of sessions were after Chavez died, and the country was really falling apart at that point. And but it was definitely a fascinating time period and a fascinating job, and I learned a lot. And in fact, that's the period in which I did my PhD, um, because every other person at Smithsonian had a PhD, and I'm highly competitive. So
What was the title of your PhD?
it was called the thesis is structural change in the music industry, the evolving role of the musician. So yeah, and it's in
Did
the
you
British.
get a book? Did you get a book out of that as well?
No, I never did, funnily enough. I have, I had written The Art of Record Production, which became The Art of Music Production, and I had not yet written the History of Music Production, but there were four editions of the original book, and then I did the History of Music Production, and the last edition of The Art of Music Production, which they changed the name to that, and the History of Music Production were on Oxford University Press. Um, but each edition of the the books about record production and music production were pretty much complete rewrites because production changed so much. I mean, I wrote the first one in '94, and the last one I think was around 2010, something like that. And you can imagine every 4 or 5 years you
Yes.
have to kind of completely rethink what you're saying because everything changed. Um, so, yeah, it was interesting, very interesting time.
Yes. So what happens in, did you ever meet Jimmy Iovine? I don't know.
And
He was a man on the scene a lot, wasn't he?
yeah, and I actually have never met Jimmy Iovine, funnily enough. I should have because I've sort of like moved in the same circles a lot. But obviously, he had an amazing career, and
Yeah.
he's somebody who stepped through a lot of different.
Well, yes, well, quite actually. Anyway,
Yeah,
so then after your period in with that institution, what happens then for the next 10 years, bringing you up to the current day?
right. So I was as at the Smithsonian. We joined this nascent, organization called the American Association of Independent Music, or A2IM, and in 2005 when it started up, and eventually I was asked to, run for the board, and I ran for the board, and I got on the board, and and then in my third year on the board, I got elected I got elected chair of the board, and then the person who was running A2IM, the president at the time, he decided to step down, and there was a big search for a new person. The board felt they hadn't found the right person, and somebody, the HR person asked me if I would consider the possibility. And I said, maybe. And next thing I know, I was offered the job and I was running the organization. So, and that was just slightly under 10 years ago. And I had promised myself since the Smithsonian, I wouldn't work another job more than 10 years. So, 18 months ago or 15 months ago, I guess now, I I told them I'd be leaving at the end of this year. And so I am. So, come January, I think 4th, I'm moving on to my next phase.
Yes, blimey. And then you got an MBE. Was that a nice thing or surprising thing to get?
Yeah, it really was. I mean, I kept getting these calls from the British embassy. I was driving around LA and they kept calling me, and I thought, and I had gotten an award from them, the British Council for, I've forgotten, education, and it was really nice. It was a very sweet thing they gave me. And so I just figured they were calling me. So they've occasionally called me and asked me to do something. And eventually I picked up, and the person on the other phone goes, "It's a good thing. It's a good thing." Like I'm gonna hang up on them. And then they said, would you be if you were offered an honor, I can't remember if they said an MBA or an honor in the Queen's Honors List, would you accept it? And I said, yeah, I would, and so they sent me the offer, and yeah, it was amazing actually.
Yes. Well, that must have been quite interesting, especially because it came at the end of the COVID period, really, wasn't it? So, something to look forward to during those first 2 years of the decade.
Yeah, yeah, it was the New Year's list 2022. Yeah.
Yes. So then in 26, then what's your next direction, do you think?
So I have a few things cooking, some of which I can't talk about, but I have a music tech startup called Audio Number that is setting about solving the metadata problem in the music industry because the music industry's metadata has always been a mess. Um, there are numbers that are allocated to various different parts of the intellectual property of music. So, for instance, you have a UPC code that goes on the package, like an LP or a CD or even a digital album. And then you have an ISRC code that goes on the track, an ISWC code goes on the song. You have an ISNI that's allocated to the artists themselves, which means, if you like myself, I mean, I'm a drummer, I'm a singer, I'm an author, I'm a songwriter. The ISNI covers everything you've ever done, and then there's an IPI that covers the songwriters and the publishers, and there's also all the DSPs, all the digital service providers. They all have individual identifiers for every track out there. And what my startup has done has gathered all these identifiers together in one big database, which people have said couldn't be done, but we've done it. And we have billions of lines of data in our database. I think we have something like 800 million recordings there. And the idea is that we are already helping people find royalties that haven't been paid through to them. There's a problem because of the sort of the bad or lack of management of metadata. A lot of recordings get sort of separated from who created the recording or who created the song, and so the payments never get made through to the label, the publisher, the musician, the artist, the songwriter, and you know, having done what I've done at A2IM for 10 years now, which is really try to sort of improve the lot of labels and artists and publishers and songwriters. This is kind of an extension of that, but in a free market way.
So where does the money get stuck, or just where does it sit before it goes anywhere else, if it ever goes anywhere else? Who
Well,
has that money?
well, there's a lot of ways it can get stuck, but one thing is the industry has these things called black boxes, and what happens is if a track or a song um, gets kind of orphaned, as it were. If it gets separated from who created it, if the information gets separated from who created it, then the money just sits there and doesn't ever get paid out. And it goes into what's called a black box. And then depending on the particular collection society, every so often, it can be every year, it can be every 3 years, every 6 years. It varies from society to society. That money gets divided up by market share, and and doesn't go to the people who actually created it. It goes to, it's split up between everybody, basically everybody who made any money that year. The problem is a lot of times, money's allocated based on a title. Well, think about how many songs were called "The Look of Love," or how many songs.
Mm,
I mean, there's almost no title you can think of that there aren't dozens of other songs written that have the same title. And that's why we have unique identifiers. But if we don't use the unique identifiers, or we don't apply the unique identifiers, or there's no sort of system for tracking the unique identifiers, then, the money goes to the wrong place. So there's a couple of places it can get hung up. One is in these black boxes. The other is it can simply be paid out to the wrong person. And so you can imagine, I mean, you brought up ABC before. They have a song called The Look of Love. But Dionne
yes.
Warwick has a song called The Look of Love. It was written by Bacharach and David. And that's just one very simple example. There's probably 1,000 Look of Loves out there. But you can easily imagine that some of the royalties from ABC might be getting paid to Dionne Warwick, and some of the money from Dionne Warwick might be getting paid to ABC if they're being matched by title. But if they were matched by ISRC or ISWC or UPC or whatever, then that wouldn't happen because these identifiers are unique. It's like a social security number or a national insurance,
Yes, yes.
that's your number, and it nobody else can have that number.
Yes, because the one thing is that everyone I speak to, it's such a murky world, isn't it? No one, when they enter that, the creative world of music, do they understand the what they're signing away and the legality of it. Quite a few musicians ended a career, after their 10 years, if they were lucky, and then suddenly found you mentioned the tax bill, so they just had to sell all their instruments to pay off that, or they never saw any money and they don't own the music still after 40 years. They don't know where the master tapes are. So a lot of people are in that situation now, really wanting to archive their work. I mean, there's certain labels like Cherry Red who are very good at this, but I think a lot of artists would just love to get something together all in one place, all the demos, all the some live tracks, the John Peel sessions, and flexi discs and singles, and have it archived. But it is quite tricky, isn't it?
It's very tricky. I mean, we've done that. I actually went back and I got the rights back to Major Label Records for Landscape, and that's where the box set came from. And then I had moved around. I mean, I started in London and I moved to New York, and then I moved to LA, and then I moved back to London, then I moved to Maryland, and now back in New York. And believe it or not, I kept those tapes with me the whole time, and I either had them in storage somewhere in my archive or I kept them with me, and I didn't even know what kind of condition they would be in, but I had them fully digitized at very high sampling rates, like 192K. Funnily enough, my friend who sadly died during the pandemic, who was the archivist for Smithsonian Folkways, one of the greatest archival engineers that has ever lived, and Pete Reiniger, and he digitized all that stuff, and it sounds unbelievable. I mean, it was really amazing because I heard it during that process. I heard it I heard those recordings for the first time in 45 years. Um, and it really took our breath away. And so that's what the box set came from. But we're lucky, and we had we'd hung on to our tapes, and we pretty much kept track of things. But actually, interestingly, this audio number project started from an initiative that I was talking to my kids about, because I'm working on it with my kids who are both coders and musicians. And I did not have all the metadata from my career, because actually when I started, there were no UPC codes on a lot of records. There were definitely no ISRC or ISWC codes. ISNI didn't exist. IPIs were called CAEs, but they did exist, but good luck, having access to them. So between us, we were able to find all mine, and that was the genesis of this, really. When we found ours, when we found mine, I realized it would be possible to find everybody's. And it turned out it wasn't that difficult if you knew what you were doing. Um, so, it's, I'd really like at this point in my career to try to, you know, make life better for young musicians and make sure the next generation of musicians, can make a living, basically, because it's become very difficult in the streaming era for musicians and writers to actually sustain themselves from a purely music career.
Yes, well, it's I mean, the 80s had unemployment benefit, which was very handy, and also, they could get that little live circuit going around. Like each city and town in the UK had an alternative indie night, so you could play in, like in a place which had 100 or two, possibly 300 people. You could get that kind of 20-day tour going, and that gave bands a sort of enough kind of energy to keep going to the next project, because something was definitely happening. And then they had a little tour of Europe, and then they come back and do a bit more recording. So it just kept that kind of momentum going just long enough before, the tricky third album, really.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I mean, actually, in a lot of ways, that's what my PhD dissertation was about. And it was. I mean, I was always, I made a living from the age of 14 playing music, and if I hadn't have gone to Smithsonian, I probably would still be making a living from making music. But I think it's a lot more difficult today if you're starting out. I mean, streaming doesn't pay well enough to keep middle class musicians alive. And most of my career, I made my living from recorded music. And that's very difficult today, unless you're a household name. Um, You really have to be quite successful and quite well known. And then, as you pointed out several times in this conversation, um, you know, people have that 5 year period if they're lucky, sometimes 10 years, but sometimes it's less, sometimes it's 1 year. And I mean, I think if you only have 1 year of success, you're probably not going to be able to, live off of music for the rest of your life. But, 3 to 5 years, you probably should be able to. Um, but most people can't, and it's very difficult to sustain a career beyond 5 to 10 years. But if you don't make enough in that period, um, then you kind of got to retrain, which is, I think, a travesty, really.
Yes, because a lot of people then sort of move into other side, either touring, being a touring engineer, sound person, producer. There's a lot of, it's like the band is just one thing, but when you're younger, the band seems to be the thing and the only thing. But then there's the other parts of it, which most people think actually this was a bit nicer to do. I don't know, working in another area, but still in the world of entertainment. I mean, talking about drummers, I did an interview with a guy who toured with David Bowie and the Glass Spider tour, and he just became one of those musicians who worked in theatre. It was just like he could just keep a beat and would just be able to do that for 10, 20 odd years. But then found that during that time he had paid, that he didn't realise, into a pension plan. So he's retiring after, he's currently on tour with John Waite. I think his
Right.
name is, and yes, became, and that was where he sort of made a living, was working in those New York musical theatres or theatres as a drummer in the pit.
Yeah.
So, but they paid, into his pension plan, which meant that he could retire. And I think
Yeah,
that,
yeah, the AFM pension plan is great. Same with SAG-AFTRA if you're a singer. But I think, I mean, I did theater for a bit. I subbed for Jesus Christ Superstar, which was interesting. But that was never it for me. I never wanted to do that. It just wasn't what attracted me into the industry. And, I had a pretty specific sense of what I wanted to do. Um, Playing the same thing every night drove me crazy. And, and also, it wasn't my music and blah, blah, blah. That's not to diss it. I mean, like, I think if that floats your boat, it's a really great thing. It's a really nice community that musical theater is, and you see the same people every night. You become friends, like you say, you get consistent income.
and
The
I
other
think,
thing,
and also I think that the other good thing is that when you have a rehearsal or something with a band that you really want to make it because that's what you love, you can ask somebody else to sub for you that night, and then know that you can come back the next day and still get a paycheck and still to be able to live. So it was almost like a bit of a security blanket, isn't it? At least you're doing vaguely the thing you love, but you've still got your eye on the other creative prize.
yeah, I mean, I think the thing that Yeah, I mean, this is definitely true for me. I think in terms of long-term planning, becoming a musician is not really the number one sort of long-term plan in life. I just was so convinced that I was going to do well that, I didn't even think about it. And I know my parents were filled with trepidation, but I was having a conversation earlier today about this, is that, you know, if you became a dentist, you could be in the bottom 1% of dentists and make a living. If you become a musician, if you're not in the top 1%, and I'm making this number up, but, I think we can probably speculate that it's a reasonable assumption. If you're not in the top 1%, you will not make a living. And if you're not in the top, say, 0.1%, you're not going to do very well. You might make some money, but you're not going to be able to kind of have a really great life. So it's pretty brutal life
Yes.
for a lot of people.
So when you brought this amazing box set together of the band, when did you start that project? When did you start to think? Because bizarrely, last night I did an interview with a band called Finny Tribe, who were Scottish actually, and they're just bringing out their box set, a 3D CD box set, and a vinyl copy and digital downloads. So
Mhm.
obviously something is in the air, isn't it, of people wanting to get some those very scratchy little live recordings, the John Peel sessions, and various other singles that they've misplaced, but then they thought, right, we've got it, we're going to do it, we've got the sleeve notes, it's all looking good. So when did your idea of landscape come about?
Well, about 35 years ago, and I started working on, I think, 89, and I didn't get anywhere. Um, and I just never let it out of my mind. I mean, I wasn't working on it every day by any means, but every year or so I would kind of revisit it and see what the obstacles were. I knew I had all the live recordings. I just didn't have the RCA recordings. Um, and it was kind of a freak situation how I got those back, but it was certainly very gratified that I was able to. And and then there was a lot, it wasn't just getting them back wasn't sort of just it. We had to get all the we had to get all the actual multi-tracks because we actually have all the multi-tracks and the quarter inches and half inches and analog tapes and everything. And then we sourced that cassette um, from Norwich Ballroom.
Yes.
We haven't accessed everything, and we've got John Pure sessions, we've got Old Grey Whistle Test sessions, which we're aware of. There's a lot more that we could actually do, and I'm hoping I certainly hope that we do it. But I reached out to the band once I was able to get the rights back. When I got it back for us, for the entire band. Unfortunately, we're still all alive and we all still get along. Nobody has any major problems. That's one interesting thing about landscape is, we're not one of those sort of VH1 MTV tragedy stories. Probably not very interesting to most people, but for whatever reason, we've all done pretty well in life, and it's been and everyone's a pleasure to deal with. They're all reasonable human beings, and we get along. So
Yes. And it's an amazing 5 CDs, 48 tracks. This is
184 tracks.
right. Blimey, even more. Jesus Christ. Yes. So a hell of a completist thing. It's did it feel sort of a bit overwhelming at times, or did it sort of
It felt very overwhelming. We had a number of offers from a number of labels. We chose Cooking Vinyl. They wanted to make it very as completist as possible. It isn't fully completist because there's a lot more stuff out there. There's some stuff on there that I probably wouldn't have put on there in the effort to make things completist. Basically, if something had come out, they insisted on it being on there. And we did have a couple of exceptions to that, but there's a lot more stuff that never ever was released that I'd like to get out, or was released on our own label. Um, or actually, we had one record out on a label called Jaguar really early on, and Jaguar, as you would say in England. And they, uh, but it's not the same lineup exactly. So I think we will eventually do that one. I hope we do. But it was really a gratifying experience to get it done. And I tell you what, it was really fun working with the band again, even though we weren't actually playing music. We had a really interesting sort of back and forth over what should go where, and it changed a lot as we went along. I had one impression of how it should be, but everybody contributed in a really meaningful way. And it felt like a very satisfying experience and a nice sort of revisiting of those relationships.
yes? Did it feel a little bit like a holistic bit of not closure, but something that felt really quite nice for the soul to experience those kind of relationships that, having a project is a lot easier than just meeting up and chatting about the old times. But actually, though you would be chatting about the old times, but with a project involved and a definite sort of idea of what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, it definitely did. I mean, it was really satisfying because like I said, there was a lot of input from everybody, and sometimes we think we had it settled, and then somebody in the band would say, "Well, what about this? This is a different perspective," and we think about it, and gosh, it's a really good idea. And because we were trying to show the different sides of it. I mean, I'm a big art fan. I go to museums all over the world, and I love art, and I love retrospectives because I like it when you go right back to like the early paintings that somebody did that you get some abstract artist or some surrealist or something like that, and then you go back to the paintings, they're sort of you know real life type paintings that they did early on, and you see sort of what their technique was when they were just doing figurative stuff. Um, and so I kind of wanted that kind of vibe, like it was a retrospective of what the band did. And I was less concerned about it being completist, but more like being a retrospective. I know I've seen a lot of um, retrospectives of great artists, and I've seen them in different countries at different times, the same artist, but each retrospective is quite significantly different because people put together a slightly different collection of their stuff. We have so
Yes.
much stuff, it's not hard to do that.
Yes. And are you finding, not only your original fans, but are you finding new kind of fans or in people who are intrigued by the band now? Because I've noticed that there is a lot more interest in the 80s, not that just the mainstream, because in the old days it was told by, people like Dylan Jones who would just go, oh, it's this, and this. And I remember thinking, well, that's not my 80s. And then I think everybody in the last 5 years have sort of, because it was very tribal as well, wasn't it? The
Yeah,
80s. It was like,
right.
what tribe are you in? You've got to decide quite early on, and a lot of people are telling their story from the most obscure bands or the most obscure scenes. So I just wondered if you have picked up a new audience who are intrigued with the sound of the band.
Yeah, we definitely have. We have some of the old, fans who liked the band back in the day who came and see the band. And we have, you know, we definitely have new fans as well. And unlike you, I often listen to retrospectives of the 80s and go, well, it wasn't my 80s. I didn't listen to any of that in the 80s. I mean, in fact, I couldn't get to the dial fast enough if that record came on. Um, and but that's life, right? Everybody has
Yeah.
different tastes, and that's a good thing. And it's a very positive thing that everybody doesn't listen to the same things. Of course, in the 80s, it was more of a monoculture because we did have less television stations, we had less radio stations, we had less formats, those kinds of things. So nowadays, it's such a fragmented world. I mean, God knows what the person sitting next to me on the metro is listening to. It's not going to be probably anything I'm familiar with.
Yes,
Um,
but we had fewer gatekeepers. On one level, that's quite good because some of them were able to create some stuff, and then you had shared culture, whereas now you could have a
right.
conversation, and the likelihood is no one's either watched it or listening to it. But in the old days, we all knew, I don't know, as an example, like Paul Simon's Graceland came out. Well, it was like everybody kind of had an opinion if they were vaguely into music, or there was just more shared things because we only had at times 3 channels or 4 channels on the TV. So the likelihood is, like with the tube that would be on a Friday late afternoon during those couple of years, we all kind of, as a sort of indie kid music fan, you all watched it. So you had that common, a conversation the next day or the next week. Whereas now I hear people talking, oh, have you seen such and such? Oh no, I don't know. What channel's that on? Oh, it's the Disney or it's Apple, it's Netflix. And so our communication breaks down quite quickly.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's the algorithmic thing where you're in your own little echo chamber, and I mean, it's just where we are in society. I mean, I think there are some deep concerns about that, but I think it seems like every period has its particular troubles. I mean, I know a lot of people think that the world is a much worse place than it was, but I said, well, how would you have felt about being alive in 1943? Wouldn't have been so great. Or 1916, or
Yes, I mean, and correct. I mean, we didn't wake up in the 80s every morning jumping for joy and saying, this is a beautiful day. People are going to reminisce about this and envy us. We just woke up and went, God, it's a bit rubbish, isn't it? It was probably, it was like, oh, Thatcher's Britain, it's terrible. But, it might have been grim, but we had some great music, which is obviously, why people probably keep on dipping into parts of it because there was so much. And you think, God, this is quite. So I listened to music from the past, but not the music that I listened to then, but the music I missed the first time because it was difficult. You didn't have stream and YouTube and Spotify. Finding a record that it'd be interested in was quite hard work, and you didn't always get a chance. If you might have read the review, but not had the chance to listen to it just briefly to know if you were going to like the singer or the sound of the band. And we all bought the record of the week from the NME and thought, oh my God, that's terrible. I'll never do that again.
Yeah, no, I've had that experience many times. I mean, that's why I have so many, um, CDs or LPs that I've listened to once and never listened to again because you read a review and the person was raving about it and it wasn't that good at all. Nowadays, you don't have that problem, of course. You can listen to anything you want, anytime you want, for no extra cost. But that's changed the way we use music as well. And I think music has kind of almost like a less important role. Like I was in a friend's house the other day in New Zealand actually, and who I used to play with in bands, and I noticed that he still had a stereo system, and two speakers. And mostly I'm in people's houses now, and there's no, stereo system as we used to know it, and there's not two speakers on either side of the living room. It's usually kind of some kind of little, you know, tube somewhere in the room that plays music and from your computer or your phone or whatever. And so, it's just a very I,
Yes.
I'm all in favor of, you know, acknowledging the time we're in and enjoying the time we're in. I mean, like you say, you lived through the 80s. It wasn't like great every day. Well, I got to say this. I mean, the 80s was an amazing time for me. I have zero complaints about the 80s in the sense of it was, I just had an amazing time. I mean, politically, there were all kinds of problems in the 80s. But all you can do really in life is you can vote for who you want to vote for and then get on with your life, because, what else are you going to do? And
Yes, well, absolutely. Yes, this is true, and yeah, that's kind of it, really. But at the same time, are you still enjoying Miles Davis' Bitches Brew? Does that still do what it did back in the 60s and 70s?
I haven't listened to it recently, but I have to say it is a breathtaking record. I mean, there's so many records from that period. That was such a groundbreaking period for jazz. You think about where music went in that time. But when you go back to any of these periods, usually, I mean, I struggle with jazz today because a lot of it seems like repetition of previous times. I haven't heard anything recently that I feel like broke new ground. Bitches Brew broke new ground. There's no question. At that moment in time, there was nothing else out there like that. I mean, there were other people, as Anthony Braxton and people, who were doing, sort of free jazz type stuff and things, and Bitches were incorporated certain qualities of that. But it really was a groundbreaking record, in my opinion.
And did you go to Miles in the 80s when I think he teamed up with Sly and Robbie with an album, I think called Tutu or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I saw Miles a few times, and through that period, I saw him when I was at Berkeley, and I saw him many times actually. I saw him, in the period when the on the corner period when he would just come on in a silver bomber jacket and his Superfly glasses and turn his back on the audience and play three notes and leave. And I think I always loved about Miles is he didn't like to repeat himself. I know, Quincy wanted to do a retrospective at Montreux, I think it was, and he wanted to go all the way through Miles' career. Miles was like, absolutely not. You know, he only looked forward. And I think I'm not quite that. Obviously, I just put together a retrospective, so I'm not that hardcore about that. But I do really admire the idea that the best thing you've ever done is the next thing you're going to do. And
Yes.
it's from your own creative perspective, it may not ultimately be true, the way the world judges it, but from a mental and creative perspective, I think it's a good way to look at life.
Well, absolutely. Look, Richard, thank you ever so much. I think that's a bit more than yes. Well, it's been amazing, and thank you for your time for this. This has been incredible. And if you want, I can always send you a link to this interview, which is in two parts.
Oh,
But
I would really love that, David. Thank you so much, and thanks for taking the time. I really,
yeah, it's been brilliant, and so pleased with the Norwich connection. Really, this is still.
yeah, no, it's
It,
amazing.
it still makes me smile. And yes, do you remember, was it the UEA, did you say, or was it another venue that you
It was
played?
the Norwich Ballroom. It
Mecca?
says on the record exactly what it is. I've forgotten now, but we played there quite a bit. I mean, East Anglia was somewhere we went through quite a lot because obviously you also have a big student population up there with Cambridge and various other colleges and stuff. So we always did all right there.
Yes. Well,
It
I
was
have to
hard to
say,
get to from London, by the way.
oh yeah, it's a pain in the bottom. But did
Yeah.
you Oh God, what was I going to say? God, that was nearly going to be a brilliant way to finish, and then I just lost the whole plot. Yes, I know that was classic, wasn't it?
Yeah.
No, I think that was it, really. I think, oh God, what was I gonna? It might have been connected to Norwich. Oh, the website. God, you got a sexy website. That was it. Is that yours? Oh, not yours, but are you the person behind the fantastically?
Yeah, it's us. Yeah, I mean, John Walters really is the driving force behind it. John runs a design magazine called EYE, and it's like a 4 times a year physical design magazine for designers. It's primarily based on fonts, although I'm sure I'm doing him a horrible injustice here. But he's well, first off, he's a great writer because he also was written for. He's a great musician. He's a great composer. He's a great writer. He's a great this. By the way, I could say the same about everybody in the band in different capacities. But John has really been the driving force behind the website, and he keeps it up to date and everything. We all contribute, but there's no doubt that John is um, is really the power behind that.
I admired the fonts actually. The landscape one is especially nice, but there you go.
Well,
It's
the landscape one that I think it was John Morrick of Le Breton that came up with that originally. So when my house in Camberwell was pretty much it was like 150 yards from the Camberwell Art College, and that's where we found John Morrick when he was a student there, and we were putting out ads in Melody Maker every week, and we needed to make our ads stand out from all the other ads in Melody Maker. So what we figured out was everybody did their ads sort of square. They either did them, 2 columns wide and a couple of a couple inches high, and or they did them, you know, vertical. And so you couldn't you had to stay within the columns. But what we figured out was if we did the design diagonally, our ad would stand out like crazy when you open the paper. So that's what we did. So we just always
yes,
tried to be different.
yes. And do you still hold or have any of your costume outfits of that period?
Yeah, I still have them all. Yeah, I haven't tried them on in recent years. They definitely wouldn't fit me now, but I had 28-inch waist in those days.
Right. Well, I have to say they are. It looks like tomorrow as well, doesn't it? Some of those pictures and yeah, with the
Definitely.
computer and the outfit as well. Are you tempted to go to the David Bowie? Sorry, I'm looking at your photograph actually. I like the plug socket in the corner. Yes, the David Bowie V&A kind of archive that they've got. Did you go to see his other exhibition about 4 or 5 years ago? David Bowie is.
No, I haven't. I mean, I'm actually coming into London for the Blitz exhibition launch at the London Design Museum on September 17th. That should be interesting. And I have seen some Bowie retrospective, and obviously, visually, his work was stunning. I mean, orally, his stuff was stunning. I said earlier that, the B-side of Low is one of my favorite records of all time. Um, Probably not most people's, but it is mine. Um, he's obviously a groundbreaking artist. What I liked about Bowie mostly was that he was not afraid to break the mold.
No.
Um, and
And I
he
have to
didn't,
say, I know it's the same album, but side I do think is it Dennis Davis, the drummer?
uh,
David,
yeah, I know who
the
you're talking about.
the
Yeah, I forgot.
drummer he had on that album, because I love the track called "Be My Wife." I think that is such a sexy song.
Yeah,
It's just such a great. It's just got the production of that album is just beautiful. But Dennis Davis or David, oh shit, I can't
I know
remember.
who you're talking about. His name's on the tip of my tongue, and I can't remember.
But yeah, it was a classic, and yes, it was memorable because my brother his first car had an 8 track, and he only had 2 or 3 cassettes, and one of them was low. This was in the late 70s, and I remember playing that a lot and thinking, God, this is very unusual, and not like
Yeah.
Changes One Bowie, but then it's yes, and then poor old Charles Sharmani Murray, who wrote that interview reviewed it in the NME, absolutely slated it and has had to live with that ever since, really.
That's a lot of the critics. I mean, I don't have a lot of sympathy for critics, really.
It was Dennis Davis. Dennis
Dennis
Davis.
Davis, yeah.
Yes.
He had some amazing players play with him over the years. I think Andy Newmark played with him on, what was it, Young Americans, I think. Um,
And Luther.
yeah, incredible. Yeah, yeah, I mean, well, the fact that every record was different too.
Yes, well, absolutely. But look, thank you ever so much. And I hope you have a nice time in London at the Blitz with Rusty.
Thank you.
And I'm
Appreciate
sure
it
that
very
it
much.
will be good. But anyway, I'll keep in touch. But thank you again, Richard. This has been
Thank you,
amazing.
David.
Thank you. Take
Bye-bye.
care. Bye bye.
You too. Bye-bye.
That, dear listener, is the end of the interview. Well done if you've got to the end. Congratulations. Do email or contact me to say you've completed it. Anyway, massive thank you to Richard for giving me the time for that. This has been the C86 show, David Eastaugh. If you want to contact me, you can on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Just do C86 show. All these interviews have been archived on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, etc. And that's it. Oh, yes, I've done lots of interviews. So, yes, do check them out. And have a great week. Stay safe.